So I could speed up this, all of this Veldt nastiness, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go ahead and just do all 256 battles in a row, but we're going to have a chat, you guys. If you don't want to watch a super long video where I talk about all of the Final Fantasy games, feel free to skip this one. When you come back, we'll be off the Veldt. Everybody will know a bunch of spells. Godspeed to you. But if you are interested in hearing some thoughts on the Final Fantasy games, that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be going through the whole series and kind of just issuing... I know we talk about it a lot, but it's going to be nice to have it all kind of localized in one place. So, Final Fantasy I played for the first time when I was very young, back in my NES days. And there's re-rays already. We already have re-rays for Celeste. I think it's a classic game. It's easily one of my favorites in the series. Go ahead and start learning quick. I think it is a pillar of video game history. Like, it would be difficult to get a good sense of... you want this, actually. So, hop out there. We're going to take that rage and learn Meteor. Unfortunately, that doesn't count against our battle counter. We're still only on one battle. Yeah, if you enjoy video game history, but you haven't played Final Fantasy, you're missing a pretty important part of it, in my opinion. So that's my suggestion, is if you like video game history, if you like JRPGs in general, but you're not quite old enough to have been around when Final Fantasy I was a thing, then... Actually, I might give Realm to Gladius, honestly, because he's going to run out of MP eventually. Oh, I'm not going to get credit for this battle either, because Gao just came back. Fair enough. So Final Fantasy I, the basic idea of the game is you build a party of 4 heroes out of a collection of 6 jobs, and then you go on crazy adventures with them. It's kind of like the basic JRPG formula. It doesn't get more basic than that without getting too basic to be enjoyable. Like, if you go any further back than Final Fantasy I, then you're getting into... Dragon Quest I territory, and, I mean... I'm not a fan, personally, of Dragon Quest I. It's way too simplistic. There's not enough to do. You spend most of the game grinding. And some people would say, well, you know, Brickroad, you spend most of the game grinding in Final Fantasy I as well. And yeah, you do kind of spend a lot of the game grinding, just earning experience, making your guys stronger, getting treasure. But the difference, I think, is... in Final Fantasy I, there's always something to do. There's always a new dungeon to go into. There's always a new boss to try out. You always have something to do other than just run circles killing slimes. And that's what really sets it apart from the early Dragon Quest games, for me, at least. So I played Final Fantasy I on the NES when I was a very young child. I don't recommend you play that version if you've never played any version of Final Fantasy I. If you play Final Fantasy I and you really, really enjoy it, by all means, go back and enjoy the NES version with my blessing. But if you haven't played a lot of JRPGs, or you just kind of want to see it as a historical curiosity, my recommendation is to play the Dawn of Souls version on Game Boy Advance, or the PSP version, which is essentially the same version with different graphics, or there's a version also on iOS. If you've got an iThing, you can play it on there. Essentially, again, the same version with slightly different graphics. That's my preferred version of the game. It's not as, like, abusive towards the player. It's not as buggy. Look at this spell that Gao can just cast for free whenever he wants. That everybody else would have to equip an Esper. Actually, nobody can... I don't have an Esper that teaches Meteor. We traded up to Raiden. We'll get an Esper that teaches Meteor, but not for a little while. So what are the differences between Final Fantasy I and, say, Dawn of Souls, which is my favorite version? That's the GBA version. Graphics look very kind of similar to this, more or less. Ooh, Cloud Wraith, that's one I want too. Yeah, I think this guy casts Thundaga. This is why we don't have to teach Gao any spells, really, because he can just leech off of his rages. So number one, the game is not buggy. Like, just as an example of Final Fantasy I's many hundreds of bugs, there's an intelligence stat in the game that you would think raises like the power of your magic, but it doesn't. It doesn't actually do anything in the NES version of FF1. It's just busted. It's just totally broken. So if you have a black mage in the party casting a fire spell, that black mage is not going to do any more damage. I have to kill this thing with magic because he has super high evasion. No problem, we have all the magic we could ever want. Actually, you don't. Well, it's dead anyway, it's fine. But yeah, a red mage can cast the same spell and do the same amount of damage. The benefit of the red mage is he can use much better equipment and other types of magic. He can use attack magic and healing magic. Whereas the only benefit of a black mage is he gets more spell slots to cast from. He can cast more spells before he has to go back to the inn. But even that's not a very big benefit in Final Fantasy I because, again, spells don't scale with your intelligence stat. So as a result, like, yeah, you have 9 slots with which to cast level 1 magic, but your level 1 magic is terrible. You don't care about your level 1 magic. Those spells are worthless. Let's go ahead and get you started on Phoenix now. Thank you. Get that re-raise a-flowing. So in Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls, first of all, your spells are not tied to slots. You don't have to make a choice. Oh, do I cast Cure 3 or do I cast Life? Because I can't cast both. They take up the same slot. Instead, you have an MP pool. So you're able to cast from that MP pool. So all of your wizards get a lot more spells before they have to go to the inn. And you don't have to worry about spells sharing the same slot. If you have Faraga, you can cast as much Faraga as you want with no limitation, as long as your MP holds. And that Faraga damage will scale along with your character's intelligence stat, which now works. It's not just broken. So a black mage is much more viable. There are still reasons to take a red mage. It's just the reasons suggesting a black mage are no longer invalid. And that's really the problem with the NES version of the game, because it's so buggy, because there's so much that doesn't work. There are traps. If you've ever played the NES version of Final Fantasy I, and if you've built any party other than some combination of fighter and red mage, you've gimped yourself. The other classes in that game are not useful. It's not that they're not useful, it's that everything any other class can do, some other class can do better. Or if not better, at least as well. The only caveat I would put on that, I think, is in Final Fantasy I, very early on, there's a boss fight. You have to fight 4 wizards, aka the Pisco Demons, aka the Mind Flayers, I think they're called in one of the versions. Ooh, Devil's another one I want. Oh my goodness. Alright. Get out there, buddy. I don't even know what the Devil casts, I just see it's here on my list. Anyway, now we have it. Very early on, these Pisco Demons, they're not weak to any kind of magic, but they don't have a particular strength against lightning magic. They do have a particular strength against fire and ice. So if you get there, you want to cast the most powerful lightning spell you can. Just so happens, around that point in the game, your characters are able to buy Lightning 3, or, not Lightning 3, Lightning 2, which is a pretty powerful multi-target lightning spell that can really hurt these Pisco Demons. So, if you have a red mage in your party, probably you're not high enough level to cast level 3 magic yet. You need to wait before you can make use of that spell. But if you have a black mage, you can use it like 1 or 2 levels earlier, which means you can get into that dungeon and get a win against the Pisco demons a little bit earlier than you otherwise would have. There's the power of the Zangetsu, or whatever that sword is called. Is sometimes it'll just destroy an enemy outright. It'll just cleave it. And it doesn't, for some reason, it doesn't count as an instant death hit. I'm not really sure how it works, but you can cleave through undead monsters just fine. Cyan can use that weapon, and so now if we give Cyan a Genji glove, he has two really powerful weapons. I know I've said that before, but I don't think Cyan will be quite as dead weight anymore. So if you're going to play Final Fantasy I, Dawn of Souls is the version I would recommend. It's such a big part of my childhood, it's actually difficult for me to go back and look at Final Fantasy I objectively. But I think it holds up, even if only in a historical sense. I think there are like modern games coming out that kind of have Final Fantasy I sensibilities to some degree, where it's just pure gameplay. It's just put your party together and go on an adventure. We get a new Etrian Odyssey game every couple years that's essentially that. These games do have plots, but the plots take such a backseat to the very basic RPG gameplay that, yeah, they matter, but they're not the main focus of the game. Whereas Final Fantasy VI has gameplay, but I would say the main focus of this game is the story. The story is what everybody remembers about this game. Also, I know relatively recently we've had games like Darkest Dungeon kind of fill that same niche. Yeah, there is a plot, but exploring the gameplay, collecting treasure, making your heroes stronger, that's really the main focus of the game. So if you enjoy that style of game and haven't played Final Fantasy I, you might find it very interesting to go back and enjoy a Final Fantasy game that kind of has that same kind of flavor. Personally, my favorite character in Final Fantasy I is the monk, or the black belt, depending on which version you're playing. I know earlier I said only the fighter and the red mage are worthwhile, and that's true. If you're looking to make the strongest party possible, it's got to be some combination of fighters and red mages. Nothing else any character can do. Even the healer, the white mage, is pointless alongside fighters and red mages, and I guess I'll unpack that a little bit. Fighters can wear heavy armor very early in the game, and they get a lot of hit points. They cannot be damaged by physical attacks. Period. It just does not happen. You cannot do it. Most of the game in FF1, your fighter on the front line is going to be taking 1 or 2 damage per attack, and they're going to have hundreds of hit points. They're just basically invincible against anything that doesn't have strong magic attacks, and very few monsters have strong magic attacks outside of boss fights. The booty shake. We're not worried about no booty shake no more. We are worried about Terra dying in 15 seconds, though, my goodness. Welcome back, Gao. And so that's what the fighter does. They get a lot of powerful weapons, they get all the good equipment, they're basically invincible. Fighters are the best class in the game by a very, very wide margin. If you were to list the top 6 classes in the game, in a game that only has 6 classes, the first 5 would be fighter, and then the 6th would be red mage. That's how powerful that is. I want to see what this devil actually does real quick. Oh, gets snorted away, apparently. Womp womp. So the second best class in the game, or actually the 6th best class after fighter, is the red mage. The red mage is a slightly less weak version of fighter that can use both white and black magic. That's what the red mage is. They're not as strong as fighter because they don't get as many hit points. They can't use all the same equipment. Their equipment set is much more reserved, but they do get access to pretty much I don't want to say the entire white and black magic set. There are a few choice spells that they don't get, but they get all the ones that matter pretty much early enough to matter, if that makes sense. They get healing spells at the few points in the game you need healing magic. They get like Fyra and Thundara at the point in the game where you want multi-target spells. I want to see what this devil actually does. Swing! I love that cleave. So really, between those two things, you've got invincible characters, so you're not going to need to heal 99% of the time. There's no point to having a white mage, because your fighters are already invincible. And if you do need to heal, like a spot heal in between battles or something, you've got that red mage, who can also learn rudimentary heal magic. And after you do the class change, the fighters turn into knights, which means they get low-level white magic as well. So, just all around, they're the best class. It's just not even... It's not even a competition, not even a little bit. So, if you want to build... If you're playing like Dawn of Souls, even if you're playing NES version, if you just want to get through the game as easily as possible, your party is fighter, 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 red mage. There you go. I've saved you all the trouble of... Oh, Thundaga. He's got Thundaga now. Nice. Fighter, 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 red mage. If you want to get real jiggy with it, fighter, fighter, red mage also works perfectly well. But my favorite class is the monk, is the black belt. So what the black belt does is they can fight unarmed. There's a stat in the game called your hit percent. Every 16 points of hit percent, your fighter gains another attack. I'm going to say your character gains another attack. I was trying to use fighter in the generic sense, but I had forgotten that fighter is actually a class in the game. Did I want that Misty? I guess I got that Misty because that's what was in the party when Gao came on back. Is fine, yes. Actually, I should be editing my list as I go too, so I don't try to get... Oh, we want this one. There's the Behemoth King. So we got the Behemoth King, we got the regular Behemoth. Trying to walk around without looking at the screen. We got the Devil. And we got the Cloud Wraith. So every character in the game has hit percent. And every 16 points of hit percent, you get another attack. I don't mean another attack like in the sense of this game, like your character will literally attack twice. What'll happen is your character will swing his weapon around. It'll say 3 hits, such and such damage. And what that means is you've done 3 separate hits because your hit percent was, say, 32 or higher is enough to get 3 hits. And then they calculated the damage of each of those hits. And in the NES version, there's a bug where if one of your attacks is calculated as a critical hit, every single attack after that is also calculated as a critical hit. It's pretty insane. What does the Behemoth King do? Oh, I guess it was the wrong Behemoth King. Oh no. Well, use regular Behemoth, I guess. And the Black Belt is good with hit percent. I don't know if he's got an improved critical hit rate, but he gets hit percent a little bit faster than other classes. And he can attack without weapons. So early on, the Black Belt is terrible. After you get into level, I don't know, 9 or 10 or so, when he starts to get to a point where he can fight without weapons, because his damage calculation is factors in his level and his, I think, strength. And eventually he becomes the strongest attacker in the game. If you cast the haste spell on him, so he gets twice, it just doubles his number of hits. You can get up to 32 hits. And then in versions of the game where physical buff spells actually work, you can make that even more impressive. So the most raw damage in the game you can do is the Black Belt, but you've really got to work to get him to that level. It's not going to happen naturally like it will for a fighter. But I do love me the Black Belt in the game. And the other classes in the game, the Thief, the Black Mage, the White Mage, they do have a role to play when it comes to challenge runs, because Final Fantasy I is very replayable. For example, one of my favorite parties to use is 4 Black Mages. I love playing the game with 4 Black Mages. That's a really good run. Even though they're subpar characters, it's like, I'm not really worried about being the best character I can be, you know what I mean? I've played the game so many times, I know all the little shortcuts, all the little ins and outs to make the game much more playable. So 4 Black Mages is a great run. Even when I'm not doing like a challenge run, I still like to take a Black Mage just so I can get in and fight those Pisco demons like 1 or 2 levels earlier than I would be able to otherwise. Like, that's worth it to me. And that is 21 fights. Unless I'm miscounting. If I'm miscounting, that wasn't 21 fights. Let's move on to Final Fantasy II. I detest Final Fantasy II. I really, really have difficulty articulating how much I detest Final Fantasy II. Oh my goodness. Okay. What relic does Gal have? Did I give him a hero ring or an earring? Because I figured I'd rather him have a hero ring. Yeah, he's got the hero ring. Okay. Final Fantasy II. If I'm being charitable, and I suppose I will be charitable, I can give it extremely high praise. Final Fantasy II... By the way, this Behemoth Rage, you can do this in the World of Balance. You can fight a Behemoth on the floating continent, go back to the Veldt, learn this Rage, and get access to the Meteor spell that early in the game. It's that crazy. Final Fantasy II had a lot of good ideas that eventually we came around on agreeing are good ideas. It has like a mission-based structure where an important NPC will give you a quest. You go and complete the quest, then you go back to the NPC to turn in the quest and queue the next quest up. The game is pretty much structured like that, start to finish. That's how a lot of Western RPGs are structured nowadays, especially sandbox games like The Elder Scrolls and what have you. Has this mission-based structure, and even Final Fantasy XV eventually came around. Or actually 13 did quite a bit with that as well. Ooh, who got Faraga? Was that Terra got Faraga? Oh, she learned it off her Esper. Yeah, she's still working. Okay. We didn't cast Faraga. And then, everything your characters do in battle in Final Fantasy II will raise the appropriate statistic. If they attack with a weapon, they get better with that weapon type, they raise their strength. If they attack with a spell, they get better with that spell, they raise their intelligence. That's the kind of stuff that happens in Final Fantasy II. If your character absorbs damage by getting hit, their HP might go up after the battle. So they've eschewed a traditional experience point system like Final Fantasy I had for this kind of, your characters will just naturally get better at whatever it is they're doing. But that kind of system requires a granularity in programming that just is not, or was not, available on an 8-bit machine. The NES just did not have the muscle to make it happen. And that's the game's biggest flaw. Okay, I have an ice spell. I would like to have a character who's good with ice magic, not because I know there's a boss coming up, because I don't have the game memorized yet, I'm just experimenting with stuff, but I have a character I want to turn into a magician. I want her to be able to use ice magic. So the only way to do that is to cast the ice spell over and 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 over, and you think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. It really is this tedious and over and over and over and over, going from level 1 ice to level 2 ice. That's 10 casts. You're already casting the ice spell. 10 casts, that's probably more than you'll cast ice in a single dungeon from start to finish. If you figure a dungeon in Final Fantasy II, maybe 10 or 20 random encounters, you'll probably cast the ice spell 10 times just over the course of the dungeon. So you'll level from 1 to 2 naturally in one dungeon. 2 to 3 is something like 50 casts. 3 to 4, now you're in like 100 casts. There's just not enough monsters in the critical path of the game to level up just your ice spell. Not to mention your fire spell, your lightning spell, your heal spell, which you can at least level outside of combat. Oh, Gao. Oh, I'm sorry, buddy. Man, that's a bummer. Yeah, we'll fix that, don't worry. At some point, we are going to have to probably pop a tent. Just to get our magic points back. So we're very slowly using magic points over time. But it's the same with, like, okay, if you want to... level up your health in the game, which is important. The thing is, if you equip armor, you're taking far less damage, and if you don't reach a particular damage threshold for a particular group of monsters, you cannot raise your hit points. So if you put on the strongest armor for any point in the game, that character can't get hit points. If you give a character a shield, and they're evading attack, that character can't get hit points. And then eventually you'll reach a point where monsters, the attacks that do land on that character are one-hit kills. Because yeah, they've got great armor, and they've got great evasion, but if the monster rolls the dice and gets around the evasion, even after you factor in the damage mitigation from the armor, it's still a one-hit kill. So you gotta spend some time wearing crappy armor, and believe it or not, the easiest way to raise your hit points is to fight yourself. Is to have your characters attack themselves. And it's just stupid. It's just really stupid. And because no matter how good the system is, the player will always kind of gravitate towards the most efficient way of doing things. The most efficient way of dealing damage to your characters in Final Fantasy II, I want this rage, I want this rage. You might remember we went out of our way to get this encounter in Cyan's Dreamscape. So we have it now. Excellent. We've got the IO rage. Beautiful, beautiful. I kind of want this rage too. This is a magnitude 8 right here. If Gao comes back on this fight, that would be very useful, actually. And he didn't. That's fine. But we did win the fight, so the counter goes up 1. So yeah, attacking your own guys in Final Fantasy II is really dumb. There's also a glitch in Final Fantasy II. So okay, if I've got my character in the top 3 slots of the party, not the bottom slot, because when you issue a command to your 4th character, the one in the bottom slot, that starts the combat round. You don't actually have to cast the ice spell to level up ice. All you have to do is select the ice spell off of the magic menu. That's enough. So, I have a character who wants to level up the ice spell. I don't have to cast the spell. All I have to do is select it off the menu, cancel their turn, and then select it off the menu again, and then cancel their turn, and then select it off the menu again, and then cancel their turn, and then select it off the menu again, and then cancel their turn, and again, you think I'm exaggerating, but no, it really is this tedious. Cancel again, and then select it off the menu, and then cancel, and then select it, and cancel, and select it. That's enough to level up ice magic. That's really friggin' stupid. Oh my god, that's really, really, really stupid. But that's the way to do it. That's the most efficient way to level up your magic, so if you have a character that wants to level magic, that's the way you're going to do it. As a result, people who play Final Fantasy II, people who enjoy the game and will defend it, will just say leveling up magic is a trap. Don't do it. All the best magic in the game, it doesn't matter how much damage you're doing with it, because it's not damage magic anyway. We're taking too long to kill this guy because we're all in the back row, but it's fine. I'm too lazy to switch. I'm missing a character in the party, so my mind keeps expecting like a Dragoon to fall out of the air and hit this thing. Which isn't gonna happen. So yeah, that's kind of brings us to my next point, is there's a lot of traps in the game. Most of the weapon types are traps, because all the best weapons in the game are swords. If you train up anything that's not a sword, that character is not going to be effective with weapons ever. By the end of the game, you're oh, I trained this character up with bows. There's not really a good bow. The best weapons are all swords, and there's enough really good swords for the whole battle. The only other weapon in the game really worth using is unarmed, kind of for the same reason as Final Fantasy I. Unarmed can get the most hits in a round. Unarmed is really, really good. Welcome back, Gal. So it's a combination of all these gameplay systems that they're decent ideas, but they just don't work in 8-bit. Now, the developer of Final Fantasy II went on to create a series called Saga. He made the Romancing Saga series, which became the Saga Frontier series, and utilized a lot of these same ideas, eschewing traditional JRPG advancement systems for something a little more dynamic. And a lot of these games are very experimental. I haven't played many of them. I'm not a big fan of most of them, I will say. But they feel very strange in a Final Fantasy game. but I don't want to say out of place, because if there is a uniting gameplay factor in the Final Fantasy series, outside of just, like, you know, the standard JRPG trappings, Final Fantasy games are always, always, always experimental. Every new game in the series does something new that no other game does previously. A lot of times these experiments become trendsetters, like other JRPG developers like, yeah, we need to start doing that in our games. Sometimes they throw out everything about the previous games and reinvent themselves. That's what Final Fantasy II did. I didn't play Final Fantasy II when it was new. It came out, I think, 1989. At that point, Final Fantasy I had not even come out in America yet. They didn't release Final Fantasy II in my region for a lot of years. It wasn't until they released a collection on PlayStation 1 is when I finally got a chance to play Final Fantasy II outside of an emulator. And the problem is, yeah, they made these re-releases, they gave them graphical overhauls, they made them look pretty, they fixed up some bugs in gameplay and stuff, but Final Fantasy II is such a fundamentally broken game that a fresh coat of paint isn't enough. The game needs to be overhauled from the ground up, and though the game has been remade several times now, PlayStation 1 had a remake, Game Boy Advance had a remake, they did another remake for PlayStation Portable. I don't know if they did it again for the iOS, but nobody's taken the work yet to go back and really fix the game's foundation. We need to break all the foundation apart, tear it up, and pour new cement. I actually have an entire blog post that I wrote a couple years ago about how fixing Final Fantasy II would be doable now with modern technology, and it would feel right at home now, because a lot of the things, like I said, that it did back in the day became staples of Western RPGs that we have now, like the Elder Scrolls game kind of thing. Like, think about Elder Scrolls. Do you want to be an archer? No problem. Equip a bow and use it, and eventually you'll get better at archery. But Elder Scrolls has a few other, it has a few ways to kind of prop up that gameplay. Like, oh crap, I want to be an archer. It would be very helpful in this dungeon I'm in. I haven't been trading archery for 60 hours though. What do? Well, you could go out with a bow and arrow and train all that time and level up your archery, or you can just find the NPC that trains you in archery and pay them. Like, Final Fantasy II should have that system. It would be excellent. I don't think I'm gonna fight this. I don't want to risk this thing killing me, and I don't want to go through all the trouble of putting it to sleep or whatever. Let's just get out of there for that one. I also think Final Fantasy II's story could be really good if it got revamped, kind of brought into the modern age, and if you really leaned on that whole quest-based structure. Like, the game has, I don't know, 20 or so story missions that you go through. Of course, the original game didn't have a lot in the way of side quests. Well, nowadays, side quests are the jam, you know? You've got your 20 main story missions. On top of that, you can add 60 side quests. Easily. Easily. And the result of those side quests could be weapons and armor that's not available in the original game. It could be any number of things that's useful to playing the game. Actually, I think the offering is an auto hit too, isn't it? Like, you can't miss with the offering. You always hit. The offering gets around evasion, the ultimate weapon gets around defense. I think I'm remembering this correctly now. But as it stands, there's no version of Final Fantasy II that I find enjoyable to play. I've only played two. I've played the original Famicom version on an emulator to completion. I played the Game Boy Advance version a couple times. I played the PlayStation version. So, understand I'm not making a snap judgment about Final Fantasy II. I have put in the hours. I have completed the game. I'm making a very worthy assessment of it. Like, I kind of know what I'm talking about. And, I mean, we're at 42 battles now, unless I'm miscounting. I'm out of time talking about Final Fantasy II. I haven't even got to mention Monster Closets yet. So, my man Gao has picked up Flare. Let's go ahead and give him Flood. So let's move on to Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III is 2 excellent games. They remade Final Fantasy III. And when they remade it, they didn't just give it a fresh coat of paint, the way they did for Final Fantasy I and II and 4 and 5 and 6 eventually. The remake of Final Fantasy III is an entirely new game. It's the same basic course of events, it's the same basic job system, it's a lot of the same basic ideas, but the order in which you get the jobs, the functionality of those jobs, and the way you advance in those jobs is so different from the original Famicom Final Fantasy III that it's practically a new game. If you play the Famicom version and then go to the Steam version, you have to learn an entirely new set of skills. And that's a good thing, because Final Fantasy III is a great game, just overall. I recommend both versions. I recommend playing the Steam version first, if you're the type of player who has difficulty with like old school graphics and things. I know those players are out there. But what they've done in Final Fantasy III is, again, they reinvented the wheel here. They're like, okay, that system from Final Fantasy II, most players didn't like it. It was really abusable and exploitable, and if you didn't exploit it, you were in for hours and hours of grinding. Let's not do that. Let's go back to our original job system. Let's go to the job system of Final Fantasy I. What did Final Fantasy I do that was really good? Well, we had 6 jobs, and they were all pretty unique. Let's, instead of 6 jobs, we'll have a lot more. We'll start the player out with 6 jobs, but then we'll open up more jobs as the game goes on. And because we're opening up jobs as the game goes on, then we're not really locking you into a party of 4 with the jobs. We'll let the player change jobs as often as they want, with a slight penalty. There's going to be a currency that you have to pay in order to change jobs. And that's the basic system of Final Fantasy III. You start out with the standard Final Fantasy jobs. Ooh, you know what? I don't need these guys. These guys do Thundaga, but he already has a Thundaga Rage. So yeah, we won't worry about these guys. You start out with the Fighter, Monk, Red Mage, White Mage, Black Mage, and... what's the other one? It's not Thief. You don't get Thief yet. Fighter, Monk, Red Mage, White Mage, Black Mage. Do you only start with 5? You might only start with 5, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. It's entirely possible. Anyway, later on in the game, you unlock a second group of job, which is where you get stuff like Thief and Scholar and Ranger, and you're starting to get kind of esoteric. You're starting to specialize more. Now, instead of having a job that's good with all the weapons, the Fighter, you have a job that's good with only one particular type of weapon. So we have a job that's really good with bows and arrows. We have a job that's really good with spears, specifically, and has a special attack that utilizes that spear to better effect than just the regular fight command. We have a job that uses items better than other classes. And then some of the jobs are just straight upgrades. For example, at the end of the game you get a Warlock and a Shaman, which aren't called that. They're called a Magus and a Devout in the Steam version of the game. But originally the game never came out. The only version we had, if we wanted to play the Famicom original, was a fan translation. So a lot of the translations don't match up between the two if you play them. But, I mean, the Devout is just a straight improvement over the White Mage. So it has that going for it. And I think the job you have with your class determines how you level up inside of that class. Like, it determines what stat gains you level up as you go. So if you start somebody out as a White Mage, and through the course of the game only give them magical jobs, they will get better at magic as they go, but they won't be as good in a fighting capacity. And that's fine, because it's like a Final Fantasy I thing. You're still essentially picking at the start of the game, I want this guy to fight, I want this guy to heal, I want this guy to magic. Just over the course of the game, there are several roles for that character to play. They can change their clothes every few adventures. This is a really robust system, and there's a lot that can be explored in it, and the game makes excellent use out of it. And one of the things the game does is it creates gimmick challenges. Okay, we've got a type of monster where when you kill it, it splits in half. Now there's 2 of that monster, and unless you're capable of dealing thousands and thousands of damage, then you're never ever going to get around this monster. You're going to be in that fight forever. You have quick. I like that. Why don't you go for holy next? But what we've done is we've given one monster, or we've given one weapon type in the game the ability to hurt those monsters without them splitting, and we've made it so only one class in the game can use those weapons. So now you've got a gimmick dungeon. Now you've got a dungeon where probably 2 or 3 people in your party are going to be one particular class for one particular reason. So now the adventure is not just getting to the end of the dungeon, or at least not directly. Like, now we can have a dungeon where the reward isn't more plot progression. The reward is entire sets of equipment for that one class, so you don't have to spend thousands of gold outfitting characters for this one dungeon. We can get a little gimmicky with it. And in adding those extra dungeons that you have to do to get that equipment, I think there's 4 of them over the course of the game. In doing that, we give the player more opportunity to get experience points and level up kind of organically, rather than just make them go back to old areas and grind fights like I'm doing on the Veldt here. So the whole game is paced a lot better than the first 2 games. You basically never have to do any naked grinding in Final Fantasy III. You might want to, because there's a lot of jobs to experiment with. There's a lot to play with in the game. But even experimenting with stuff for a new player, that's not naked grinding. That's not just running in circles killing slimes, you know? You're doing something very useful with your time. Realm has the strongest spell in the game now. Let's make sure we can give her quick. Next. So that's what Final Fantasy III has over the first 2. There's no grinding. There's a very robust and very unique job system, which Dragon Quest III also has a job system, and I'm not sure which of those 2 games came first. I think Dragon Quest III came first with its job system, where you have like a guild where you make characters at a guild of a particular job who you can then assign to your party. What Final Fantasy III did was tweak that and made it so you always had the same party, but you could change jobs as you go. Another really cool thing Final Fantasy III does, and this is really cool from a plot standpoint, is there's multiple world maps. You start the game out in a little tiny area surrounded by mountains. You really can't get out of those mountains. You run a few adventures, you gain a few levels. Eventually you get an airship which gets you out of the mountains into a larger area. That's kind of standard. Final Fantasy I does the same thing. But eventually you reach a point where you realize the world map you're on is only a very tiny, tiny part of the entire world. And there's way more to do. And the first time I played the game, I wasn't using a guide or anything. That was a big holy crap moment. Because you get an airship and you fly off the edge of the world into an enormous, vast, empty world. And it's incredibly empty. There's only 2 locations to visit. And you're like, what am I doing here? And then you have an adventure there, and then the world fills up. And it's another plot moment where, like, oh my goodness, the ramifications for why the world was in that state and what I've just done. It's such a departure from the first 2 Final Fantasy games. From a plot standpoint, your actions actually matter now. And they matter in a way more than, oh, you've tripped the plot flag, and now the NPC will give you the next quest. Or, oh, you've tripped the plot flag, and now the bridge will be there for you to cross. And then there's the remake of Final Fantasy III. They originally made it for the DS, and they ported the DS version over to Steam. And first of all, the graphics are totally overhauled. It's 3D graphics now. They have these really charming low poly graphics. They kind of look like retro polygonal graphics at this point, because originally it was for the DS. The DS is not a very powerful system at the time. But the Steam version looks the same. I think the game looks incredibly charming. One of the things they did for this version is... Yeah, we're just gonna behemoth this guy, because I guess we can't rage him. So one of the things they did was, instead of having 4 just onion kids in your party, just 4 kind of blank slate characters that don't matter, they actually gave you 4 heroes to use. You have, your party now has Lunith, Ark, Refia, and Ingus. And they don't have a lot of characterization over the course of the game. It's not like Final Fantasy VI, where every character has their, like, this deep backstory, but it's just enough characterization to be charming. It's just enough to feel at home in Final Fantasy III. If they had gone full hog and had this whole big, like, every character has a backstory and a plot line and 100 lines of dialogue, this is the one we want to leap on. Oh, we're already raging, though. Ah, okay. Well, you know what? You're undead, so we'll just go ahead and do this. I get it. This is the one we need to leap on. Well, we'll win this fight and get another behemoth suit, which means we can go back to the Coliseum and get a 3rd snow scarf, which we can give to Mog, which we will probably do. Oh, Terra's gonna die. Unless this finishes the fight right here. Please? 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 No? If this finishes the fight, we won't have to raise Terra, but we have to raise Terra before we do any more damage. Because if we don't get credit for... Oh, good. Good, perfect. Yeah, if she had died, we wouldn't have got credit towards the shield. Oh, we got 2 more behemoth suits. Oh. Do I have any sleeping bags? I don't. We're gonna pop a tent. Because Realm is now out of MIPS. What was I talking about? Final Fantasy III, right? Yeah, that's what I was talking about. If you had like a whole, like every character has his backstory and 100 lines of dialogue, it would not have felt authentic in Final Fantasy III. You do have some story beats that you hit, but they're very reserved. They're very like old school compared to this. It wouldn't have felt right to have all this dialogue and everything in Final Fantasy III. So a slight bit of characterization, just a little bit, just enough to give the characters a little bit of pop. I mean, the main thing that the game does is, instead of having, like, 1 sprite for each job in the game, each character has a unique outfit, or a unique version of the outfit for each job in the game. So really, that's the main upgrade. It's, graphically speaking, it's, oh, every character puts their own little spin on each individual job. Which is very nice. Terra now has a re-raise. And now you're going to get Ultima. The other major change between the two is, in the Famicom version, in order to change jobs, you had to spend a resource called CP. And I can't for the life of me remember what CP standard for right now. I'm sure somebody will leave a very off-color joke in the comments of this video now that I've said that sentence. But that's not what I meant. And if you don't know what I meant, don't look it up. So if you wanted to change jobs, you didn't have enough CP, you couldn't. You gained CP as you won battles, so usually you could change jobs like whenever you wanted to, as long as you didn't want to constantly. Like the way I play the game, I put somebody in a job and leave them there until I get the next set of jobs, and then we just kind of upgrade from there. And for that, CP is fine. The Steam version, instead of CP, has job sickness. You can now change as often as you want with no resource, but when you switch into a job, you're sick. Your stats are lowered until you fight a certain amount of battles. I don't think either system is good. All it does is prevent experimentation. Like, if you want to see if a new job is good for a character, you can switch them to that job, but then you gotta fight 5 battles before you can really see what they're capable of, because you gotta push through that job sickness first. Not a super big deal. The way the game is designed, you're really not supposed to be switching jobs every single battle anyway. It's just kind of too bad that the systems are in place preventing it. Let's talk about my favorite Final Fantasy game now. The one that I have the most super nostalgia for. Final Fantasy IV. I put Final Fantasy IV on the straw poll when I said, hey guys, I'm going to let's play a Final Fantasy game. You've broken me down over the years. Let's put an RPG on the channel. What do you want to see? Final Fantasy 3, 4, 5, or 6. And Final Fantasy VI was the winner. Not by a large margin. Final Fantasy 3 was only behind by a couple of votes. So a couple of you guys now who are watching this who are thinking, oh man, Final Fantasy 3, that sounds like a way better Let's Play. You should have been following my Twitter a few months ago when I put up that straw poll. Go follow my Twitter. At 140% speed. Go do it. Final Fantasy IV is the most nostalgic game I can think of. And I've probably spent almost as much time with it over the years as the original Final Fantasy I. Possibly. So, Final Fantasy IV made two major changes over the formula, because every Final Fantasy game innovates in some direction. Number one, they did away with the turn-based, the round-based battles. Battles are still turn-based, but they're not round-based. The first three games, you input commands for all of your characters, and then you watch as all of your characters and all of the enemies act out their commands, and then it goes back to your command window. Final Fantasy IV introduced the ATB system, Active Time Battle, and that's the system you're seeing now, where a bar fills up. Although you didn't get a visible bar in 4, there was an invisible one for each character. Fills up, and when that bar is filled up, it's that character's turn. And then that character can act. In the meantime, the enemies are also taking their turns, and the most powerful thing this does in battle, two things. First of all, you know what order your characters are going to act in. They're going to act in the order in which you input their commands. If Terra's dead, and I'm in an old round-based system, if I'm in Final Fantasy III, and I use a healing item on her to revive her, the risk I run is that I can't heal her and revive her at the same time, because the character who's healing her might get their turn before the character who's reviving her, in which case the heal spell will be ineffective, and then the revival will be ineffective, because now she comes back with only a couple of hit points, and a monster might kill her the same turn. Final Fantasy IV, you don't have that problem anymore, ever. Where's my holy water? There it is. If I cure up a revival spell, and then cure up a healing spell, I know the revival spell will come out first. That's a huge change. The second change is monsters, their AI patterns can now have counterattacks. Because monsters aren't limited to just one attack per turn, the way they were in the previous few games, they can have in their script, okay, if I get hit, I'm going to do this. It doesn't matter if it's not my turn, because we're in active time battle. It's not going to feel cheap if I get to take multiple turns. So bosses could be made much, much more dynamic. In a round-based RPG, Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3, and the earliest Dragon Quest games and such, all you could really do is make boss fights bags of hit points. That's really all you had going for you. Because they only got one action to your 4 actions. And that's kind of unfair. You can pile up on the actions. The only way they could balance it is to make them bags of hit points. In Final Fantasy IV, I can make all of my boss fights way more dynamic. And they did. If you look at the AI scripts for bosses in Final Fantasy IV and 5 and 6, almost all of them have something like, what do you want next? You got Flare. What do you want, man? I guess take Kiraga. I don't actually want to give him Phoenix, because he might be raging and not able to use re-raise. I want the 3 girls to really prioritize re-raise. So just as an example, we were fighting Deathgaze a while ago. Deathgaze gets to take 1 action per round. Or rather, he has a little bar that fills up invisibly, and when his bar fills up, he gets to choose what he does. Like, I cast Arrow or Death or Blizzaga or whatever. But he also has counterattacks. If I get hit by anything, I'm going to attack. Or I'm going to cast Death. Or whatever it may be. So the boss fights felt so much better in Final Fantasy IV because of the active time battle. So that's the first major, like, groundbreaking improvement that they made. That was so different from any other JRPG that had come out before. It felt totally new. The other major change was Final Fantasy IV was the most story-driven RPG ever. Ever at that point. RPGs had stories. Even stuff like Dragon Quest IV has a really robust story to it, but Final Fantasy IV had a narrative. It wasn't just a few dialogue boxes that kind of push you on your way. Characters spoke lines. It was scripted like a play. And every cutscene had all of the characters kind of offering their own exchange. So you cared about these characters. They had depth and nuance. They had personalities. They had backstories. They joined and left the party at particular times in the game when it called for it. Each character had their own unique style of fighting. You couldn't change jobs whenever you want, but you still had a black mage in your party. You still had a monk in your party. And there were a few new jobs that could do new things that were very cool and interesting. And you cared about this world because things would happen to the world. Castles would get destroyed. Bosses would hound you through several dungeons. Instead of trying to protect or collect the crystals in Final Fantasy IV, you were trying to defend them against the villain, and you didn't do a good job. Every crystal got stolen as the game went on. So now when you reached a dungeon, in the first few games, or in the first two games rather, 1 and 2, the goal of the dungeon was to get to the end so you could get whatever item was hidden there. So you could trigger the next plot flag. Final Fantasy III had a few more reasons to go into dungeons. Now they have dungeons full of equipment. They're only there to make your party stronger. Final Fantasy IV, the goal was to see what happened next in the plot. Because the plot never stopped. Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 had kind of open worlds. You had a lot of stuff you could do. You had a checklist of things that you had to do by the end of the game, and then you could go kill the last boss. Final Fantasy VI has that kind of structure in the world of Ruin. Final Fantasy IV did not have that structure. You had a storyline that went from beginning to end. And each new thing you did brought you one step further in the story. And it could be massive, sweeping changes. You could be in a totally different part of the world, with totally different characters, with totally different goals, after just one dungeon. That happens repeatedly in Final Fantasy IV. It's not a big surprise that game managed to capture my imagination the way it did when I was a kid. And I played that game repeatedly as a child, and even as an adult. I think I played Final Fantasy IV at least once a year, every year, probably for 20 years. Nowadays, my Final Fantasy yearly replay has been replaced by Final Fantasy V, but we'll get there. We'll get there in a minute. See, it's hard to think of a game at all that's more nostalgic to me than Final Fantasy IV, and I really was hoping when I put up that straw poll that Final Fantasy IV would win, but it didn't. Alright, what do you've got? Holy now, awesome, and I know you've got this, and I know you don't have Flare yet, and you don't have Flood yet. Go ahead and learn Flare, why not? Actually, scratch that. Belay that. We're going to give you Bahamut when you go back to a dungeon so you get the HP 50. Go ahead and learn Flood, why not? So, I was hoping Final Fantasy IV would win. It didn't. If you want to see me Let's Play the game, I have a screenshot Let's Play of the game. I'll make sure to link it down into the doobly-doo of the video. It's very in-depth. I think it took me 2 years to complete. I played the original SNES version of the game. And I go into incredible detail about why I love that game so much. Nowadays, for first-time Final Fantasy players, people just getting into the series, I think people would see it as quaint. There's not a lot to recommend it. There's not a lot of character advancement you can do. Characters are kind of hard-coded in their own way. The ATB system is done better by pretty much every other Final Fantasy game to come after it. But it's always got a place in my heart. Forever and ever. Amen. So, Final Fantasy V has replaced Final Fantasy IV as my yearly game of choice. I used to play Final Fantasy 1 and 4 every year. I still get around to 1 every year, I think. I still think I've played 1 once a year. Usually I stream it. I know I've streamed that game a couple times now. But Final Fantasy V has replaced 4 as my yearly excursion into the SNES era of Final Fantasy games. So what did Final Fantasy V bring to the table? So Final Fantasy III looked at 1's job system and said, how can we make that feel a little more dynamic? Final Fantasy V looked at 3's job system and said, how can we make that feel more dynamic? And they made 3 major changes. I think the third is a major. So the first major change is they did away with, we're not fighting these guys. Can't run away. Oh, this might get interesting. Let's see if Raiden works on them. It won't, but let's see if it will. No, it doesn't work. Okay. I mean, I guess we just go ham sandwich and hope for the best. I mean, we got Shell and Protect up, so we might be okay. You'll get to see a bunch of these cool spells I've been stockpiling then, because I really want to take care of these guys. Like, I really want to take care of these guys. Oh, that's right, they always respond to magic with Holy. How bad is that for me? We've got Shell up. I think we'll be okay, actually. So the first change they did is they removed the penalty for switching jobs. They just got rid of them entirely. Okay, they absorb water. I didn't know that. I do know that now. You know what? You just attack. We're going to see that Holy spell a lot. Oh, you know what? Let's just do this. We just do this to get out of this fight. I didn't think of that, but yeah, we just leave this fight away. I don't even care about this rage, but it just ends the fight. So we're not sitting here. There are a few bosses on the Veldt, as we'll see. Yeah, this will just take care of it. After we sit through the Ultima animation. I guess we'll go to Doma when it's time to heal. Because there's a bed right there in Doma. Because eventually we're going to run out of tents. We'll probably use all of our tents before we're done here. Oh, Terra is going to die. It's not a dangerous fight, just super long. Because every time you hit them with magic, they use Holy. And all of our best attacks are magic. But hey, you got to see the Flood in the Ultima animation. That's cool. I mean, she was gonna die anyway, so joke's on you, nerd. Gao, please, what are you waiting for? Go. We input his command like an hour ago. Sheesh. There we go. Okay. Finally. So there's no penalty to switching jobs in Final Fantasy V, and because the game uses magic points instead of spell charges, what you can do is, okay, I have a knight in my party. He's got MP. He's going to need to spend his MP on because he's a knight. But outside of battle, I can very quickly switch my knight into a white mage to heal and then switch him back into a knight for no penalty. You can do it as much as you want. So that's the first cool thing the game does. The second cool thing the game does is you can customize your abilities. So I have my knight. He's leveling up his knight. But because I've been swapping him to White Mage here and there, he's also got a few levels of White Mage. So now I can just cut out the middleman. I can just take any White Mage skill I've learned and put it on my Knight. So I can have a Knight who can cast White Magic. Or a White Mage who can, say, use Knight Swords. Or any other combination in the game. And That's where the exploration is in 5. It's not just which jobs are cool, it's now what combinations of job abilities are cool. And I'm not exaggerating when I say there are hundreds of different things to do easily. Hundreds, because there's so many different combinations. You can mix and match however you want, and you got 4 characters in the party to play with. You can go crazy in Final Fantasy V. I forgot to advance my... I think we're up to 86 battles now. But I feel like I missed... I don't know. 86-ish. We'll say maybe 86. So the third thing Final Fantasy V does is it has way more jobs. Like, way more jobs. That's a little unfair. I think the actual number of jobs over Final Fantasy III isn't that much more, but it doesn't have any redundant jobs. It doesn't have both fighter and knight. It doesn't have black mage and warlock. So what it does have, it says, okay, you got a black mage, you got your summoner, your white mage, we got a blue mage we'll start you out with, you got that. You got your red mage, your knight, your monk, your thief, all the basics. Now we've run out of basics. Now we've got to invent new stuff. So some of the stuff they put in are jobs from Final Fantasy III that they made better. Ranger is better, Geomancer is better, Summoner is clearly better. What am I missing? Bard is way better. But then they ran out of those. I'm like, okay, now we got to start inventing new stuff. Now we got to have a dancer. We got to have a chemist. We got to have a samurai and a ninja that can dual wield weapons. And there's so many more new jobs that, in addition with the other things, with the no penalty and the mix and match, a new player to Final Fantasy V who doesn't know anything going in can easily spend 100 hours picking the game apart. If you like gameplay in JRPGs, if that's the reason you play these games, Final Fantasy V is the game to start with. That's the first game you want to play in this series. It has the most robust job system and the most open-ended character advancement by extension. Like, contrast with the character advancement in Final Fantasy VI. You level up like normal, but each character has stats that make them good at particular things. I could teach Cyan every magic spell in the game, but his magic stat's just not good to start with. So, I mean, there's a reason we're out here with the 3 girls. They have the best magic stats. It makes sense to give them the most magic. That's why we're here with this particular party. There is a mild sense of that in 5. Your character's starting stats are hard-coded. Some characters are better than others, but their stats go up as they level up, or in this game, their stats only go up if you equip espers. Most of the character customization in this game comes from relics and equipments, which is a less robust system than the job system. I played 6 first because it came out in my region first, but if you played 5 first, mechanically 6 had to have felt like a downgrade. There's just no comparison. Yeah, you get 14 characters and they have access to all these cool things, but you can't really mix and match. You know, I can't really have a... Unless you're talking about Go-Go, you can't have a character that can both throw and use blue magic, you know? It's just not in the cards. Mechanically speaking, 5 is easily the best game in the series. I mean, there's just the most to explore there. And when you're done exploring, and you go look up all the stuff you missed at the people who have been data mining the game for years and years, you'll find the most new stuff that you missed. You'll find jobs that you thought were bad that it turns out they're not bad, they're just really, really obscure in how to make them good. You'll probably find side quests you missed. Like, there's just so much there. The story is terrible. Final Fantasy V has a garbage story. It has fun characters. There are some fun scenes. The dialogue is okay, you know. The characters themselves are really good, I'll say. I like the characters a lot. The theme of the game is friendship. That's, in fact, the game's soundtrack is called Dear Friends. Because the idea is you have these 4 characters who go through this adventure together and they become really, really close. So that's the selling point of the game. Aside from that, the closest I can come is it's a comedy game. There's so many scenes in the game that are just there for silly comic relief. But everything that happens, whereas Final Fantasy IV, there was always this sense of urgency to everything you do. I think I want this, but I forget why. I think it uses Tsunami. That's why I want it. I guess it doesn't matter if I learn Tsunami because I taught him the Flood spell. Well, whatever. He's leapt now. I can't unleap him. So Final Fantasy IV, there was a sense of urgency to everything you were doing, and there was no levity. There was no comedy. There was no... Everything was dire. Every scene, you were trying to protect something, or get something back, or save or heal something. Final Fantasy V, going from scene to scene, the strongest driver in the plot is coincidence. Most of what happens in the game happens because of coincidence and happenstance. Like, just as an example, your ship sinks. Oh no, our ship sinks, what do we do? But it just so happens it sinks on the only place in the world that has a flying chocobo you can take. Which just so happens to be the only thing in the world that swallowed your job crystals. That just so happened to be blown apart from the last dungeon by a massive explosion. Wow, how lucky are we? And then we take our flying chocobo, our black chocobo, back to our guys, and then we go through the next dungeon, which just so happens to connect to this crazy underground tunnel, which just so happens to link up to the area where our ship sank. And hey, it just so happens that there's also an airship parked there that we can take, which just so happens to coincide with the next adventure where we need an airship. In Final Fantasy IV, your characters identify the need for an airship, decide to travel to the place where the airship guy lives, get waylaid on the way there, have to go on some adventures to get back on track, and only then do you get to go get your airship guy. Like, you set the goal earlier and there are obstacles in your way. In Final Fantasy V, there's never really a sense of having a goal at any point in the plot. And then you have the villain of the game, XIII. XIII is the worst villain in the series. It's like, oh, this series has some bad villains in it, but XIII is the worst. And I've mentioned in a previous FF6 video, I know why XIII is the worst. Because he wants to destroy the world, and that's stupid. You know? Why does he want to destroy the world? There's no reason for him to want to destroy the world. And he's this, like, cartoonish, like, Saturday morning villain where he shows up and, "Mwahaha, I am so evil. Can you believe how evil I am? I am the most evil." That's XIII in every scene. That's all XIII really does. Every scene with XIII is that. Hey. So yeah, no, not a super big fan of XIII or the story in Final Fantasy V. It is the weakest story in the series, I think, and it's the weakest villain in the series, but the gameplay is so strong. Now, why do I play it every year? There's an event that takes place it starts every spring and runs through the summer. You know what, you're going to get Ultimate on, fool. You shouldn't have gone invisible. Now you're going to get Ultimate on. Called the Final Fantasy V 4-Job Fiesta. And this is a really cool way to play the game. So you have all this freedom in Final Fantasy V. You got, like, I don't know, 20-some jobs. You can change them however you want. You got 4 characters to change however you want. However you want to do it. It's all up to you. Final Fantasy V 4-Job Fiesta is a restrictive way to play the game. The way it works is, there's 4 crystals in the game that give you your jobs. When you reach the first crystal, you tweet out to the Gilgabot, who rolls a dice and says, "This job has 6 crystals, and your job from this crystal is..." And it'll either be Knight, White Mage, Black Mage, Blue Mage, Monk, or... what am I missing? Was that 6? I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. But, now you gotta switch all of your characters to those jobs. Or Thief. Thief is the one I was missing. Where's my behemoth? There it is. Oh, Realm is zombified. That's not good. That's not good for her. She got zamboed while I was in the menu. And then later in the game, you get the second crystal. And so Gilgabot rolls the dice again and says, this crystal has 5 jobs, and of them you have to use. And now you have 2 jobs. And the idea is you do that for every crystal, so you end up with 4 jobs. And those are the only 4 jobs you're allowed to use for the entire game. That sounds really stupid and restrictive, but it's actually a much better way to play the game, because those restrictions make you solve problems. I'm going to use up all my potions because these are just worthless anyway. Just drink up, kids! Enjoy the potions. Final Fantasy V, you can fall into one of 2 traps. The first is decision paralysis. You can make your characters do anything, and there are hundreds of options, so what you'll probably fall back on are just the safe jobs. The first few times I played the game, I did it with black mages, samurais, monks, just the safe jobs. The ones that I knew were good, and I knew how they worked. But kind of a boring way to play the game. You don't get to experiment a whole lot. Final Fantasy V 4-job Fiesta, now you're locked into 4 jobs. You're restricted. You don't have the choice. So each new boss fight is like a puzzle. Okay, how do I use the resources I have available to me with these 4 jobs, the equipment that they're able to use that I have access to at this point in the game? How do I put that together to get through this boss fight? And you have to do research. You have to talk to other players who play the game. You have to experiment and try out. You really have to push all the way to the edge of the jobs you roll. No player who played Final Fantasy V for the first time spent any amount of time in the Beastmaster job. The job looks cool, it has a unique weapon type, it has some cool skills, but nobody used it when they had stuff like Summoner on the menu. It's just true. I played a Final Fantasy V 4-job Fiesta where I had to use the Beastmaster, and it was fun. I mean, it got aggravating at some points, but I'd never used the job before. The game had to move in a totally new direction, and that's been my experience every year I've played the Fiesta. I've done 6 Fiesta runs now with 6 parties, and every party was something very cool and very different. So now I play Final Fantasy V once a year rather than Final Fantasy IV. Although I still get around to Final Fantasy IV once in a while. I mean, you still got to pull it off the shelf. So there's one job in Final Fantasy V that I hate. It's terrible. And that is the Berserker. So the Berserker is the worst job in the game, easily. He's uncontrollable the way Yumero is in this game. But first of all, he doesn't have any hard-coded protections the way Yumero does. Yumero has incredibly high defense and can block a bunch of elements just right out of the gate. Oh, we gotta pay attention here. We gotta kill the first one, and then leap the second one. So I won't use Stray Cat, I think. Every time we get new rages, the rage list kind of goes, oh, you know what, let's do this. Let's do Io. I forgot we got that Io. I kind of just want to see the Io skill. It's cool looking. You'll like it. You'll enjoy it. It's a fire spell. Should hit hard. Here we go. And the higher level the target is, the more damage it does. There's a cool spell absolutely nobody else can use in the game. Ha ha ha. Can't Blizzaga somebody with a Minerva Bustier. Don't even try it, son. Okay, so let's cycle back. Oh, he's raging! I made him rage! Why did I do that? Aw, now I'm sad. Now I'm sad sauce. Oh, I'm so stupid. Oh, I guess that also works on him, even though he's undead. Okay, well, okay, that's fine. Whatever. I mean, we'll just live with it. We'll just live with it. There's nothing else you can do about it. So yeah, the Berserker doesn't have any protections in Final Fantasy V. He's the slowest class in the game. I think by several points, which means he doesn't act as often. And a lot of bosses in Final Fantasy V have trick targets. Like, there's a lot of multi-target bosses in the game, and some of them have dummy targets. First of all, if you have a multi-target boss, you probably want to focus your fire somewhere. You don't want a character in your party, just selecting someone to fight at random. Indeed, this is why you saw I didn't use Umero in particular fights where I wanted to put enemies to sleep or confuse them. With Berserker, you don't have that luxury in Final Fantasy V. There's a version of the Final Fantasy V Fiesta called Berserker Risk, because they know it's the worst job in the game. If you roll Berserker Risk, it's a charity event, so every X dollars the charity raise, they put one more Berserker into the Berserker Risk pool. So if you roll Berserker Risk, you might end up with multiple Berserkers in your group, and every year, there's some poor schlub who's got to run the quad Zerker. They got to do a 4 Berserker party, which I can't even articulate how utterly boring that's got to be. It's Final Fantasy V, the mechanical powerhouse, the best job system. There you go. There's my recommendation. Play the 4-job Fiesta. It's a great way to get introduced to the game if you've never played it. Because during the Fiesta, there's always people to talk to about the game. There's a Discord set up for it. There's always a bunch of people in my own Discord when I'm streaming it who are running the game to work as a knowledge base. You can learn how to use some of those esoteric classes. If you like JRPG gameplay and you like job systems, Final Fantasy V, it should be your Turkish delight. So the next game is Final Fantasy VI. But, I mean, we've been talking about that for, like, what, 50 videos now? So we'll skip Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VII. Most people, I think I'm safe in saying this, most people of my generation and anyone younger than me who play Final Fantasy games started with 7. I feel pretty confident in saying that. Final Fantasy VII reinvented JRPGs as a genre, if not mechanically, graphically. Because now the game is 3D, you have these gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds, it's launching on the PlayStation 1, it has full motion video cutscenes, so not only does it have the cinematic cutscenes of Final Fantasy VI, and the larger storyline focus of this game, but a lot of those story scenes you get movies to play. And the movies looked, I mean, now they look dated, even quaint, I would say, but at the time they looked phenomenal. And there's a lot more story. A lot more story to the game. There's entire stretches of games, and I don't mean short stretches. I mean, I gotta see what Enuo does. I mean 45 minutes plus in some cases that are just storyline, just cutscenes and dialogue, revelations about the plot, and if these areas do have any combat, it's totally trivial. Like, there's a section early in the game that's like 40 minutes long where you have a superpowered character who wins every fight in one hit. It's a flashback scene. It goes on forever. It's so long, at one point, the flashback pauses and says, hey, you want to save your game? And then goes back to do more flashback. RPGs have always had story. JRPGs have always had story. And Final Fantasy VI did a little bit to kind of level up what those stories were like. Final Fantasy VII leveled it up like 4 or 5 more times. And for the 10 years after Final Fantasy VII, every JRPG tried to be Final Fantasy VII. This thing's weak to fire, so we're going to try to... I didn't Flare Star. He'll be dead by the time Gao's turn comes back around. I would say Final Fantasy VII is about on par with character advancement as 6 is. Because you do have ways to customize your characters and what abilities they have and what magic spells they can use, but each character has a unique weapon set, and each character is good at different things. They have different spells that they'll use, or stats that kind of determine how good their magic or abilities will be. The real dynamic thing in Final Fantasy VII is the limit break system. Final Fantasy VI introduced a system to where if your character's really low on health and they choose the attack command, there's a slight chance that they will do a more powerful attack. Final Fantasy VII took that system and codified it. This is so rare to happen in Final Fantasy VI that you can play the game for 50 YouTube videos and never see it. And chances are we will never see one over the course of the rest of this game unless I go out of my way to show them off, which I'm not going to do. You can YouTube them. Final Fantasy VI Desperation Attacks. It'll take you a few minutes to watch them all, and then they don't need to be in my Let's Play. What 7 did is it codified these Desperation Attacks. Instead of only coming out when you're low on health, now every time you sustain damage, that a little bar fills up onto your character's hit point bar. And when it's filled up, you get to use a limit break, which is kind of that game's version of Final Fantasy VI's, you've already got Holy. So that's it, now you just want Flare, but you're going to learn Flare naturally. Oh, you don't have Thundaga. Go ahead and get Thundaga. Actually, let me double check and make sure everybody's learning something. I might have missed a spell in there somewhere. Nope, you're fine. You're fine. And you're fine. And adorable. And almost done. That's Final Fantasy VII's version of how Final Fantasy VI, everybody has their own command. In that game, instead of having somebody with, like, a tools command, you've got somebody who has limit breaks that do a particular function. Like this limit break might hit magic instead of hit points. You can lower an enemy's magic points with it. There's a character who has a very early limit break you can get that puts haste on the whole party. There's a character who has a limit break that can make the whole party literally invincible, although you've really got to go out of your way if you want to see that one. And then everybody has an ultimate limit break that kind of defines what that character is in the end game. The hero of the game, Cloud Strife, who is, I'm pretty confident saying, the most popular and famous Final Fantasy hero ever. I mean, the man's in Smash Brothers, for Christ's sake, and Final Fantasy VII has never even been on a Nintendo system, ever. They should have put a version on DS. That'd have been fine, but they didn't. So, his ultimate limit break is 15 critical hits. That's it. That's his limit break. That's what he does at the end of the game. So you've got a little bit of character customization with the... Because you've got a kind of equipment called Materia that instead of teaching magic like in this game, it just grants you magic. And then as Materia level up, you get more powerful magic. So it's just like a slight twist on the Esper system. I'm using Io on itself. That doesn't seem fair. But it's a lot more robust than the Esper system. In this game, everybody can have one Esper. In that game, you can fill up all of your slots on your weapon and armor with materia. Everybody can easily have a dozen different kind of materia if you really want. Phoenix is open, and you definitely want Curaga and Raise and Re-Raise and all the good stuff. Curaga's the big one. Curaga's the one that'll probably get the most use, but Re-Raise has a few key areas where it's going to be helpful. Final Fantasy VII is not a game that I go back to a lot, though. It's extremely long. Final Fantasy VI, I mean, I'm saying, yeah, 50 videos in, but the game clock's only got about 15 hours on it, you know? It's going to have considerably more than that after we're done with this whole cursed shield nonsense, but it's not really a game, unless you know all the crazy speedrunner stuff, it's not a game you can just blow through quickly. So it's not a game that I replay a lot. You know what, as fun as it is using all these bonus ones, I think Stray Cat is just quicker. Just Cat Scratch comes out quicker. And that's that. We're almost halfway done. A few more fights, we'll be halfway done. So, how many times? I played Final Fantasy VII. I think I played it 2 or 3 times when it was new, in the first few years after it came out. And then once every couple years since. One of the drawbacks of 7, when you take it in the context of the whole series, is, first of all, it is the ugliest game. It looked amazing for its time, but it's the most graphically dated Final Fantasy game so far. Even its other PlayStation 1 contemporaries have aged a little bit better because they came out a little bit later in the PlayStation's lifespan. They had more I guess they had more resources to make better looking polygons and better animations and things, better shaders for light and things. So graphically, it's probably the worst game in the series. And the reason I say that is because even when you look at, like, these games, the pixel games, the pixel artwork is really good. It ages a lot better. And then when you go back and look at the old 8-bit games, all of those games have had graphical upgrades to look more like these, or in Final Fantasy III's case, get the low poly count. It looks more like a like Final Fantasy 8 and 9 do. But aside from that, I think 7 has a really weak... Do you have Quick? You don't have Quick. Get it. Get it. Get it, son. I don't want to say it has a weak villain, but it has kind of a weak sequence of events. And I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but Sephiroth is kind of a cheesy villain. He wants to summon Meteor to destroy the world, but he wants to destroy the world in such a way that he is able to benefit from it. Like, the world will be destroyed, kind of in the sense that the world of Ruin is destroyed. But in destroying the world, Sephiroth will absorb a lot of magic power and be able to put it to use. So it's like, whatever. But all you really do with Sephiroth is chase him across the map. The game is 3 discs long, and more than half of the game is on that first disc. And all you do for the entire disc is just chase Sephiroth around. Oh, the man in black was seen going in this direction. We'll go in that direction and find a town, and then that town is tied in some way to one of our characters' backstories. That's kind of how the entire first half of the game is structured. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that. It's a way to get the job done, but I just find Sephiroth to be so overwhelming, or so underwhelming as a villain. You don't really win any victories over him, or him over you, over the course of the game. The game plays up this connection he has with Cloud, but even that kind of falls flat, because that's Cloud's story, that's not Sephiroth's story. Look at the rise in power Kefka enjoyed over the course of this game, over the course of our 50 videos. How he started out as an Imperial peon, and he gets a little bit of magic, and then he finds these Esper world, and then he assassinates his own Emperor, and then he destroys the planet, and now, like, Sephiroth doesn't go through that rise to power. You learn his backstory, and that's it. He's just a singular motivation. And that's a weakness, and I think that weakness translates into the game's plot, and then that weakness of the plot reflects on the game's characters. Because I think the game has a weak cast as well. Don't get me wrong, it has some enjoyable characters, and there's some fun character moments, but overall, like, what 6 did with its characters was amazing. And 7 didn't really build on that. And 7 has a smaller cast, and each character is less of a function of the plot. They join your party at point A, you play the game until point B when you learn the character's backstory, and that's it. They just chill on your airship for the rest of the game. That's true of everybody except, like, the main characters, Cloud and Tifa. And then Sid. Sid gets some characterization, really. That's about it. So, let's talk about Final Fantasy V too. Because they made a Final Fantasy V too. It's called Final Fantasy VIII. And the reason I say that is, for one thing, the game is purely mechanical. It is a number fiddler's dream. If you like playing around with lots of different mechanics, if you like finding broken combinations of stuff, play Final Fantasy V, and then play Final Fantasy VIII, and you can thank me later. Final Fantasy VIII is the only Final Fantasy game you can break within 1 hour of gameplay. You can boot the game up, watch the opening cutscene, and then, if you know what you're doing, break the game wide open in the first hour with very little effort. And the game is fun like that. It's fun to be super powered for the entire course of the game. It's also fun to play the game and just kind of screw your way through it. You know, make suboptimal decisions. You can get through the game like that too, kind of exploring around. Or you can not do either of those, and there's a button in the game that kind of works like optimized for Final Fantasy VI. Like, okay, we'll just give you the best stuff we can figure out and run. And the game works like that too. So, I don't want to go too in-depth with Final Fantasy VIII systems because I'd have to uncurse 2 cursed shields in order to fit all that discussion in. But the idea is you equip summoned monsters, and each summoned monster has a group of abilities you can pick from, so you assign your abilities, and then you can, instead of having magic that you use, and you can use it, magic functions the same way it functions in any Final Fantasy game, but you can also equip your magic to your statistics to increase your statistics. For example, if I learn a cure spell, I can junction that to my hit points, and every copy of the cure spell I have makes my hit point maximum higher. And I have a summon monster called a Guardian Force in that game that has an ability that can take items from my inventory, turn them into magic spells. So I can buy a bunch of tents or whatever and turn them into cure spells. And I've got another Guardian Force with another ability that can take a spell, a low tier spell, and turn it into a high tier spell. So I can buy a bunch of tents, turn them into cure spells, then turn the cure spells into Curaga spells, then junction Curaga to my whole party. There you go. You've got 9,000 hit points in the first hour of the game. It really is that easy. So there's a lot to like in the systems. You can also exploit the desperation attacks. You no longer have a limit break meter. Actually, I do want Behemoth for this one. See if we can wipe them all out easily. Now what happens is there's a lot of different variables that determine whether or not your character can do a desperation attack on their turn. For example, being low on health is one of them. Having an ally dead is another one. There's a bunch of other ones. And there's a magic buff you can cast to automatically put your character in that state. So you're still making choices of, okay, who's got the best limit breaks? From Final Fantasy VII. Like, that's still in the game. That still matters a lot. But there's also an enormous amount of customization as far as getting Guardian Forces, getting abilities from those Guardian Forces, using those abilities to craft spells, finding spells out in the world or stealing them from monsters, figuring out which spells go best with which stat. It's amazing how much depth and complexity there is in that game. You look weird without a wall. You look weird without a wall. Don't like it. Don't like it. Don't like it. Do not. Finish it. I'm closing my eyes till the battle's over. Oh, I guess there's not going to be a victory theme, so I won't know when the battle's over. Okay, never mind. Oh my goodness. I don't like it. I should put a wall in there. I'm gonna splice a wall in there so you guys don't have to witness the terror that I witnessed. Thank me later. Okay, so Final Fantasy VIII. The reason I'm calling it Final Fantasy V too is it has that depth and complexity. It has a million different combinations of Guardian Forces and abilities and magic and spells and all sorts of stuff. There's crafting systems to worry about. There's a card game to play, and you can get cards which you can then turn into items. Or it's like it never ends in this game. It just never ever ends. But the story is the actual main crux of the plot. Like, ooh, I actually want this one, don't I? Yeah. Yeah. There you go, leap. Take it away, gal. Yeah, the actual crux of the plot is pretty cool. How you have this, like, time-traveling witch who's trying to absorb the power of previous witches, and it gets kind of cool, I will admit. But the game has such a lousy localization that it's almost impossible to even know what's happening in the story of the game without reading a plot summary. Like, if there's any Final Fantasy game that's in desperate need of an updated localization, it's Final Fantasy VIII. Without a doubt in my mind. And who knows, maybe one day it'll get one. I don't remember why I wanted the Lunatis, but I have it now, and it's the last one on my list, except for the Undead Behemoth, which I won't rage again next time I see him. I'll make sure we do it right. So, there's just a lot of plot contrivance in Final Fantasy VIII. There's just a lot of coincidence, and it kind of just feels bad over the course of the game. I almost leapt right there. Here's the worst of which, is you get a cast of characters, and they come together, and oh, Terra's dead. That's interesting. They come together, they go on adventures, and then halfway through the game, apropos of nothing, you suddenly learn, oh, wait a minute, we all know each other, and grew up together. And we just forgot. And the reason they just forgot is explained, but it's explained in a very unsatisfying way. Oh, Terra's dead again. Isn't that interesting? The idea is that Guardian Forces, which are the source of everything in the game. They're the source of your abilities. If you don't equip a Guardian Force, you can't use any abilities. You can't use magic. You can't do anything at all. You can't junction anything to your stats. You can use items. I think that's it. You can use items and desperation attacks, and that's it. But your stats suck. You have no hit points. You have no magic, no nothing. But if you equip them, they erase your memories for some reason. That happens. And so at one point in the plot, there's like, oh, Guardian Forces erase memories, and that's why none of us remember each other. And then that particular plot point is never brought up again. And there's a few things in the game that have that same kind of feel to it. Like, your hero is starting to fall for this girl, and then you find out that, oh, she used to date his rival guy that hates him, even though they don't live anywhere near each other geographically, and there's no way they could have met previously, as far as I can tell. Like, there's a lot of stuff like that in the game. There is, however, quite a bit of levity in the game. Again, like Final Fantasy V. There's more like comedy in the game than is typical for these styles of game. There's a lot of scenes that are silly, a lot of character moments that are silly. There's a couple of characters that's kind of their job, is to be the comic relief character in the plot, which is something that Final Fantasy VII could have done but didn't. So Gao has Curaga, even though he never put on the Phoenix Esper. You got Flare, my man. I'm not giving you Ultima. Go ahead and learn. You know what? Hastegha and Sloga. Because we might be in a situation where we don't have our Hermes or Miracle shoes on. So Final Fantasy VIII came out, and it's the first Final Fantasy game to come out since 7. I mean, obviously, it's Final Fantasy VII plus 1. Or Final Fantasy V too, if you want to call it that. And it was very, very different from 7. The mechanics are totally different. The story, it's a totally different kind of story. You did not want to do that. Because now I'm just going to Faraga you. So I was in high school when Final Fantasy VIII came out, and I remember a lot of people didn't like it. Compared to 7. Because remember, 7 was a lot of people's first Final Fantasy game, and that's not what I wanted to see. That's not what I wanted. We have Shell up, so it's okay, but not what I want to see. A lot of people didn't have a sense for every Final Fantasy game is unique. Every Final Fantasy game brings something new to the table. They thought Final Fantasy VIII was going to be a sequel to Final Fantasy VII, which they loved, and it just wasn't. It's a totally different game. I'm going to pop a tent here because we're low on MP. Oh, actually, we're going up in tents. Monsters are dropping them periodically. Oh, that's good. That's good to know. Which means we'll drop another save. There's not much on the Veldt that can kill me, but there are a couple things on the Veldt that might be able to kill me. So Final Fantasy VIII has one of my favorite heroes in the series, Squall. And I didn't like Squall at first. Because Final Fantasy VII introduced this hero who's kind of this mopey, emo kind of character, which kind of became the standard in JRPGs for a while. And originally I felt like Squall was just an extension of that. He's the same kind of mopey, teenage, nobody understands me, kind of just contrived hero. He felt like Squall 2.0. Final Fantasy IX had the exact opposite of that as the hero. And he's got a great line in the end of the game where he says, "No cloud, no squall shall hinder us." And I'm like, yeah, whoever wrote that line understood that that type of character didn't resonate with a lot of players. So, at first I didn't like Squall for that reason. He's kind of cool looking. He's got a good fashion sense. He wears a cool bomber jacket. He's got a pretty bitchin' scar on his face. He uses a gun that has a trigger, so that's kind of neat. But upon replaying the game just a few years ago, for my We Didn't Cast Faraga video, I had to replay Final Fantasy VIII to get some footage. And what I noticed in the game was, yeah, Cloud has those like mopey, emo thoughts, but he doesn't express those thoughts. They're always in his head. That's always him monologuing. Whenever he's speaking, whenever he has a speaking role in a scene, he's efficient. He has leadership qualities. Like, he has nothing but contempt for his companions for much of the game, when he's forced to go on adventures with the likes of Zell and Selphie, or he's forced to do a job for Renoa that he considers to be beneath him. But his outward dialogue is always... He exudes leadership. He's strong. He's efficient. He can get things done. He delegates tasks to other heroes. He doesn't just pussyfoot around the game, kind of the way Cloud does, and kind of the way a lot of other heroes from that era did. And it's easy to see how I missed it the first time, because there's a lot of dialogue in the game where Squall is just thinking to himself. We see inside of his head, and that's kind of unique when it comes to storytelling in the Final Fantasy series. There's a scene in Final Fantasy VII where we literally go inside of Cloud's head. That's not what I mean here. We don't get to see Cloud's inner monologue or Terra's inner monologue. If they wanted to have a character who you always knew what was going on inside their head at all times, we're not going to rage this time. We're going to do it right. So you can magic. Go ahead and... Oh, this is a really fun Esper to show off. We'll just go ahead and cast this. So it'll be fun. It'll be happy fun times. Squall was really the first one where you got inside of his head. So that's where I got confused. There's a point in the game where your military commander is like, okay, Squall, you're in charge now. And that never made a lot of sense to me, because why would you put this dillweed in charge of your group? But if you were to play a version of the game with all of Squall's monologue cut out, you would see, oh yeah, no, he makes a good leader. He gets the job done. He knows what he's doing. He doesn't make bad decisions. He delegates tasks. As opposed to... I guess we're going to have to finish him up. I thought that the jump command would finish him off, but it didn't. As opposed to his rival Cypher, who is very impulsive. He bucks the rules. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do at a given time. Squall is very different. And those differences are meaningful. And so then when I played Final Fantasy VIII and I made this realization, it's like, oh, he's actually a really kind of cool character. I don't think there's anything else quite like him in the series. Final Fantasy X's heroes kind of like that in some minor sense. We'll get to that, don't you worry. But that's something I really appreciate about Squall when I went back and replayed the game relatively recently, just a couple of years ago. So the leveling system works different in Final Fantasy VIII. You level up with experience as you go, but the monsters also level up with you. Everything scales to... I don't know if it's an average of all your characters' levels, or if it's just Squall's level in particular, but level cap is level 100. And so on my stream, we had a guy in one night who told us it would be impossible to play the game if you started at level 100. And we took that as a challenge. So here's what we did. because I didn't have the Steam version of the game at the time. I'm sure there are mods that let you max out your level in the Steam version, but at the time I only had my PlayStation 1 version. So somebody in my chat, one of my main chat dudes, PokeDude, managed to hack a save file that they downloaded on the internet for the original. There's Behemoth King. Yeah! We got it. We in there. Hacked a save file to start everybody at level 100. Converted it to a format that could be read by PlayStation 1 memory cards. Found a way to download that format onto an SD card. Loaded it into my PlayStation 3. And then convert it back into a PlayStation 1 memory card. So I could then load Final Fantasy VIII at level 100. And it wasn't impossible. It actually wasn't even that difficult. It was hard probably for the first hour, but that was it. I mean, here's the thing in that game is you can get a lot of magic from monsters by drawing them out. You're actually stealing their magic. And monsters have more powerful magic to draw the higher level they are. So starting out, we had a few real dicey adventures with real high-level monsters, but once we had the magic from those monsters and junctioned that magic to our stats, we had leveled the playing field. And then the rest of the game was trivially easy after that. Final Fantasy IX, in the opinion of some people, is the last Final Fantasy game. There are some people for which Final Fantasy IX was the death of the series. If you're going to play through the Final Fantasy titles, if you're new to the series, do not start with 9. Make sure that you play... If you've been listening to what I've been saying the whole time, and any of the first 8 games appeal to you, play all of the first 8 games that you want to play before you play 9. 9 was the capstone of the early Final Fantasy series. After 9, the games changed so dramatically that they become almost unrecognizable. What 9 does is it takes the first 8 games, it puts them in a big pot labeled Nostalgia, and it just boils and stirs the pot. And it's a very familiar game to those of us who played all of the previous games. By the time 9 came out, I had played all of the previous 8 titles to completion at least once. So it's a very nostalgic and familiar game, even if you've never played it before, provided you have some Final Fantasy experience. And I don't want to say you can't understand what's going on if you haven't played the games, just you'll get more out of it. The nutrients available in Final Fantasy IX are stronger if you have that history of playing the previous games. Mechanically and story-focused, the story, the mechanics of the game are also all very familiar. There's nothing new. Nothing new happens in Final Fantasy IX that hasn't happened before. The mechanics are very similar to Final Fantasy IV. They go back that far, where every character has one particular thing they do. You can't change their job. You can't mix and match. Each character has an equipment set of their own that determines what abilities they can learn. So each character has their own set of abilities that they learn. So there's not a lot of character customization. There's no sense of really mix and match. And for most of the game, you can't even adjust your party. The game tells you what party you have for the next session of the game, which is a big departure from the previous 3 games. So, what does Final Fantasy IX do, then, that... what does it bring to the table? And I think Final Fantasy IX has one of the best stories in the series. It's a fairy tale story. It doesn't try to resonate with like modern audiences, or what were modern audiences in 2000 when it came out, back in the I call it late 90s or very early aughts. One of the two is when Final Fantasy IX came out. But it's a fairy tale story. And it does that in a way that previous Final Fantasy games didn't, because it kind of knows it's a fairy tale story. It has all the same tropes. It has the dashing vagabond hero, and the first thing he does in the game is he kidnaps a princess, and it has a lot of that going on. Like, all the characters are so wonderful when looked at in that light. And I don't feel like I can talk at length about Final Fantasy IX. There's really just not a lot to go into. I mean, my first exposure to it, when I played it on the PlayStation 1, like, just play the whole game with a big grin on your face. That's pretty much how I did. Like, I'm just smiling just thinking about it. I actually replayed it, Faraga? That's what we get with Behemoth King? A boss monster? Aw, oh, come on. Come on, man. Well, alright. So yeah, it's a weird place in the series, because it doesn't... I wouldn't suggest that players start there as their first Final Fantasy, because of all the train spotting, because of all the little Easter eggs hidden throughout the game from the previous 8 titles, that you'll be able to say, oh yeah, I know where that's from, that's really cool. But on the other hand, it might be a good place to start if you don't care about that kind of stuff, because the mechanics are still so basic. It has a basic ATV battle system. You have 8 characters that each can do one thing, basically. And that's really it. It's just a linear game with linear advancement mechanics. Where's my stray cat? So Behemoth is better than Behemoth King. And that's just sad. That's just pathetic. Yeah, you got your linear advancement, you got your characters that are each good at one thing, you got just a nice fairy tale plot. It is the first Final Fantasy game that has a really good localization. Like, all the characters have a distinct voice. All of the dialogue actually makes sense. The, like, weapon and ability description all tell you exactly what they do. You don't have any weird edge cases like you did in 7 and 8, and even 6 in the original translation of 6. So it has that going for it. Final Fantasy IX also has one of the best minigames in the series. So you get a Chocobo at one point in Final Fantasy IX. He's like your Choco buddy. You only get one Chocobo in the whole game, and the idea is you can call him to your position using an item out of your inventory at particular spots on the world map. So like, okay, what can we do with this? So we're going to say, we're not going to just put in a treasure hunting minigame. We're going to put in 2 treasure hunting minigames. So the first thing you can do is play Chocobo Hot and Cold. There are a few separate maps where you get on your Chocobo and you find items, basically buried. Small amounts of gold, healing items, nothing really spectacular, but you can also find treasure maps. And that's when the real game starts. So what you can do is you take these treasure maps, and all the treasure map is just a static image of somewhere on the world map. That's it. That's your... I mean, you get a little clue if you read the descriptions of the treasure maps. Like, you get usually a very vague clue about where to go. And you have to correlate that with what you're looking at. And then take your Chocobo to that point in the world map, and then you get the real treasure. One of 2 things will happen. Either you open a treasure box with just tons of great loot in it, or you'll level up your Chocobo. Your Chocobo will get stronger. Like, the first thing that happens is you get the ability to, instead of just walk across land, now your Chocobo can also walk across rivers in shallow water. Then you get the ability to walk across mountains, then you get the ability to walk across oceans, then you get the ability to fly. And I got so much enjoyment out of the Chocobo treasure hunting game that I've never skipped it. I've done it every time I played Final Fantasy IX over the years. These Sasukis we're racking up here from fighting these guys, which we originally fought on the floating continent, that's probably a good thing for Shadow to throw, actually. We might get some good mileage out of that. We're not going to Behemoth the Behemoth. Oh my goodness, my drink's almost gone. I might have to take care of that in a minute here. In fact, guys, I'm going to pause the game and go get my drink situation sorted, and I'll see you after the jump cuts. I went to pour a glass of ice cold, delicious Pepsi, and I spilled it and dropped it, and didn't fill up my cup, and it was the last in the bottle of Pepsi, so I had to walk to the store to buy more ice cold, delicious Pepsi, and that's why the timer says 17:06 now. And my controller shut off. Back to work, Brickroad. Oh, let's get resituated in my chair. Oh, that's comfortable. It's so hot outside. Oh my goodness. I didn't check my phone to see what the temperature was, but I'm pretty sure it's 893 degrees outside right now. And it doesn't matter what temperature system you use, that's a lot of degrees. Actually, I don't know how hot 800 and whatever 7 Kelvin is, so maybe I should backpedal that statement. I was talking about Final Fantasy IX. But I don't remember if I was making a particular point. It's a good game. You should play it if you like Final Fantasy games, but I wouldn't play it as my first Final Fantasy game because you would miss out on some of the fun train spotter stuff. And then Final Fantasy X. Okay, so 10 is the only game in the series, or in like the main numbered series, I'll say. There's lots of spin-offs and stuff that I either haven't played or played and don't really enjoy. But 10 is the only one that I dislike. I don't dislike it quite as much as 2. But 10 and 2 are bad games, in my estimation. Although, 10-2 is actually very good. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry about that. I had to turn my phone up when I went outside in case it rings. I can't, you know. And then I forgot to turn it back down when I came back inside. And then I made a noise at you like it was your fault. And it wasn't your fault. That's why I'm apologizing to you now. Final Fantasy X. Here's the problem. I mean, there's lots of problems, but here's the problem. Final Fantasy VII introduced this concept of like having a fully animated cutscene, this movie sequence. It's unskippable, but that's okay because it's exciting. You get to watch Cloud ride down the stairs on his motorcycle, or you get to watch Atomos eat an entire castle. Like, it's these really bitchin' cutscenes. Like, they were the main selling point of Final Fantasy VII, 8, 9. 10 introduces voice acting. And where in 7, 8, and 9, you had to be kind of reserved with these unskippable movie sequences because there's just not enough room on the disc and there's not enough resources to animate like every scene in the game. Final Fantasy X came out on PlayStation 2. You have a lot more storage space on your disc. I think that was Terra's Thundaga there. No. Somebody learned Thundaga. Oh, Celeste learned it. Do you have Holy? You do have Holy. Do you have Flare? We're going to give that to you later. Go ahead and finish those up. So yeah, you have a lot more storage space on the disc. Now you can have a full cutscene for basically everything in the game. And the graphics are a lot better too. Just the graphical fidelity in general is a lot nicer on PlayStation 2. So even the scenes that aren't pre-rendered videos can look really nice. They can look almost as good as the pre-rendered videos on the PlayStation 1. Actually, they look better than that because the resolution is better. But the voice acting. So, because there's voice acting, and because voice acting is not as resource or storage intensive as video is, you really have everything I want you to have? I don't think I really care if you have Ultima. Yeah, you go ahead and take Alexander, that's fine. Every scene in the game is voice acted. In Final Fantasy IX, yeah, you got the movie scenes, but they couldn't have a movie scene for every single scene in the game. So the scenes that weren't movies were just the standard, like, dialogue boxes that you read on screen. So if you're replaying the game, if you're going through the second or third time, you just click, 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 right through the boxes pretty quickly. In Final Fantasy X, every single scene is voice acted, and every single scene is unskippable. And the voice acting is terrible. Absolutely unforgivable. The bad voice acting in Final Fantasy X, write this down, this is an important statement. The bad voice acting in Final Fantasy X does more damage to the story and characters in that game than any terrible localization has ever done to any previous JRPG ever. There are some legendarily bad localizations out there in JRPG land. None of those stories or characters are worse off for those bad localizations as X's story and characters are for the terrible voice acting. And it's not the voice actor's fault. You have some good talent in Final Fantasy X. And I don't just mean like Japanese voice actors that they taught to speak phonetic English, which is something some games actually did in the PlayStation 1 era. No, they hired real voice acting talent. Tara Strong, John DiMaggio is in this game playing characters, and their direction is just awful. They're not given anything, they're not given good enough direction. And then the two main characters, Tidus and Yuna, have the worst voice actors by far. So most of the dialogue in the game is one or both of these characters, and it's phenomenally terrible. Oh, right, we have to burn these guys down with spells. Or Ultimate Weapon is fine too. Alright, so there goes Re-Raise. And so the story in Final Fantasy X is just awful for that reason. You don't have Flare yet, you learn Flare. But then the mechanics are bad too. So they changed up the battle system a little bit. It's no longer an active time battle. Now everybody takes a turn, kind of like the really old school days, but instead of combat rounds, like your speed determines how many turns you take. It's actually very similar to the turn system in Final Fantasy Tactics, which I skipped in this list, but now that I'm looking at my list, I probably should not have skipped. Oh well. So yeah, you actually have a turn order on the screen, showing when your characters are going to attack in battle, based on like their speed stat, what action they picked, etc. And then any characters not in your active party are in your reserve party, and you can switch them up as much as you want. Characters are kind of like Final Fantasy IX. They have their own set skills and abilities, but you're on this giant sphere grid. You're on this giant linked grid of stuff. And you level up your characters by moving them along and unlocking spheres on the grid. Every character starts in a place on the grid, and you kind of have a linear progression along the grid, determining what that character can do. For example, your Black Mage starts with like Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, gets a couple of like plus magic statistic spheres, and then eventually finds Fyra, Thundara, Blizzara. It works like that. It would be fine if the characters were in Final Fantasy IX style and just leveled up as you went and got the new spells and abilities that they were going to need. But they wanted the sphere grid to feel unlocked. They wanted it to feel like anybody could do anything. So for 80% of the game or so, the sphere grid is linear. You have to go in and level Tidus up along his path, Yuna up along her path, Lulu along her path. But then you reach a point in the game where you can move people off their own grid. Here's why I hate this system. A system like Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy V even, where everybody can do anything, is fine. I'm willing to spend a lot of time in the menu hand-picking relics, measuring statistics, mixing and matching abilities. I'm willing to put in that work if I'm actually in control of how my characters develop. I'm willing to make sure that Celeste has all of the spells or all of the relics she needs to make her ultimate weapon work if I know that that ultimate weapon is going to be really, really good. I'm also willing to put up with a perfectly linear system. I don't know what else you have to learn, baby cakes. Okay. Yeah, you know what? I don't want to change the party out, though. I was going to say, let's take her back to the airship and switch her out for somebody else. But no, let's just let her finish learning all the nickel and dime spells. Yeah, I'm also willing to put up with just a linear progression like Final Fantasy IV. You gain levels, you learn spells, that's fine. In that game, you don't have control over how your characters develop, but you don't have to spend half of the game time in your menus, pulling buttons, flipping switches, and whatnot. Final Fantasy X is a linear system without any of the pros of a linear system. And it's a customization system without any of the pros of a customization system. At any given point in the game, for the first 80% of gameplay easily, there's only one thing your character can learn. There's this the next sphere on the grid for them to unlock. There's Terra's quick, beautiful. And that's it. You have to go into the menu. You've got to pick the item that unlocks the next sphere. You've got to go over to the next sphere, click on it, wait for the little animation, and now you can use the one thing you should be... Why doesn't the character just learn it automatically? I don't know. So you can do a little bit of customization later. There's only one sphere grid, and all of the characters are on it. So by the end game, if you really want, you can unlock every sphere for every character. I played Final Fantasy X twice to completion, and both times, by the time the story was over, my characters were just reaching the end of their part of the sphere grid. They were just getting to the point where... And some players took it 100 hours past that and did all the customization and stuff. I would have liked to have done all that during the course of the game. Might have taken the edge off the terrible story and kind of plotting battles. So, just... Mechanically, it's a bum deal, and then... Story-wise, it's a bum deal, and Blitzball is stupid and boring, and I hate it. Fortunately, they made a sequel called Final Fantasy X-2, and my first thought about Final Fantasy X-2 was, that is the stupidest name I've ever heard for a sequel, ever. You can't have a number and then another number. That's absolutely stupid and ridiculous. But that's what they did. The second thing... My second thought about Final Fantasy X-2 was, oh, it's about Yuna and her friends in their underwear for the whole game. Because all of the promotional materials show Yuna and her friends in their underwear for the whole game. But it does have Final Fantasy in the title, so I did play it, and Final Fantasy X-2 is a phenomenal game. I love it. First of all, you got a job system. Lots of mixing and matching going on, but it's not the same kind of mixing and matching as Final Fantasy V. You have 3 characters, and there's like, I don't know, 20 jobs or so. The jobs level up in abilities. You get to pick which ability each job learns as you level up. It's all pretty good. You can't mix and match jobs. What you can do is change jobs in the middle of battle. So there's a lot of depth and complexity to the system, but not so much as Final Fantasy V or VI or any of the other mix and match games. Which is good, because they did away with the turn-based system in that. They brought back the ATB, and then they put turbochargers on the ATB. The ATB in Final Fantasy X-2 moves so fast, and actions can be interrupted. If you interrupt an enemy's attack animation and kill it, even if it's already started its attack, it doesn't get to attack you. Its attack hasn't landed yet. Multiple abilities or attacks can land at the same time, so it has almost an auto battle quality to it, but you kind of get to pick what the auto battle is based on what jobs your characters have at the time and like what your cursor memory is pointing at the time. And battles are so fast that it's very frequent for the results screen after the fight to take longer than the battle did. So it's this incredibly fast-paced game. Final Fantasy X had very deliberate battles. Every single time a turn came around, you could... Oh, you don't have Ultimate yet. Somebody else has always had it. No wonder you're having trouble looking for stuff to take. But you have Ultima, my dear. Final Fantasy X, you get to look at pretty much the perfect game state of the battle every single combat round. What's the best possible decision I can make right now out of all the possible decisions I can make? Final Fantasy X-2 ain't got time for that. Final Fantasy X-2 is you gotta push the button fast. No, faster than that. You're not pushing... These monsters are gonna eat you alive if you don't get in there and hammer that button. In fact, Yuna starts the game as a class that's starting ability is hammer that button, fool. So it's just a very fun and visceral battle system. The game's story does not take itself seriously, but it still has, like, a sweetness to it. Like, it's not as dire as Final Fantasy X. It doesn't have the weight of Final Fantasy X. Every mission in the game is silly. It's goofy. Your main, like, they're not the main villains of the game, but you have these rivals who are like Pokemon Team Rocket, and they follow you around, and you have a back and forth with them, and every outfit in the game is ridiculous. But underneath all that, the game has a heart. And that really surprised me when I played it. I loved the gameplay when I played it. Like, I was down for some just super fast-paced ATB. But what really surprised me was how you find this, like, core sweetness, this core heart of this game, which is ostensibly fan service comedy game. There's a mini game where you have to give a naked woman a back massage. That's the level we're talking about here. Like, that's what we're working with when we're talking about Final Fantasy X-2 story sequences. And playing X-2, there's fewer cutscenes, the cutscenes are skippable, and somebody in Square Enix learned about voice directing. So the voice, even though the voice actors are the same, it's better quality. You don't have to choke it down. But, and I really don't have time to get into this. I want to make a YouTube video about this specific topic. But the contrast in themes between 10 and 10-2 is one of 10-2's greatest strengths. It uses the contrast in themes, the theme of 10 being a cycle of death, and the theme of 10-2 being discovery, essentially. Discovery and growing up in a new world where death is not looming over your head. And it uses that contrast to tell a different kind of story in a different way, but it still manages to have a good amount of soul to it. There's still a nice beating heart at the core of that game. And it made me retroactively appreciate the setting of Spira from the original Final Fantasy X more when I went back to it, because that contrast is so great. Even though it's like a silly, goofy cheesecake game, it doesn't betray what Final Fantasy X had already done. So 10 is garbage, 10-2 is exciting. I'm not going to talk about 11 or 14. They're MMORPGs, they're multiplayer games. I did play 11 for a very, very long time. A couple hundred hours at least, which is not long in MMO period, but for me, in a game, that's a long time. 14 I only played very briefly when it was in the open beta. It was terrible, it was unfinished, it was broken, it was awful. They since relaunched the game from the beginning. Can I run? No, okay. So I really don't want to fight this thing, but I guess we will. Just go ahead and stray cat. We'll just fight him to death. We don't need to get fancy. Yeah, they broke the game down when it got such terrible reviews. They relaunched it as a Realm Reborn, which I haven't played. I have people who do play it that tell me that it's excellent. I also hear that Final Fantasy XI, now that game, it hasn't been retired yet. It's still going strong. But I hear that game state is in a position now where it's very solo-friendly. You can go in, just absorb the story. I personally would love to play both of those games. I simply do not have the time to play an MMORPG in my life right now. Back in the day, back in my early 20s, I rocked me some City of Heroes, played the hell out of some World of Warcraft. I'm not pooping on MMOs. I love the idea of an MMORPG. I wish I could play one in my life. The closest I can do in my life right now is Diablo 3. And I'm already behind on that game's content. There's already expansion I haven't been able to get yet. So I'm not going to talk about 11 and 14, except to say there's nothing bad about MMORPGs, and I do think they are deserving of being called Final Fantasy games. Some people don't think that 11 and 14 deserve to be main series Final Fantasy games. Probably it would have been better if they had been Final Fantasy Online and Final Fantasy Online 2, but the games do not betray the rest of the series. They are worthy inclusions. That's all I'm going to say about those two games. Let's move on to Final Fantasy XII, which is kind of the black sheep of the series. A lot of people hate that game. A lot of people did for a long time. And still do, actually. I think Final Fantasy XII gets undeserved criticism compared to other games in the series. Like, one of the... Like, oh, it's stupid how there's a spear you can't get if you open a treasure box and you have to have the guide to know which treasure box. Like, yeah, that's stupid, but every game in the series does stuff like that. It's not just Final Fantasy XII that does that. But here's why people didn't like Final Fantasy XII. It's a very different kind of story. Very different kind of writing. Different across the board, I mean. Like, yeah, you're saving the world, that's what you do in the end. You have a group of plucky adventurers, but They really dialed down the anime tropes heavily for 12. They gave it a more political story. It's filled with intrigue. It can be hard to follow at times. There's a lot of players in the story that the hero, that the player, the protagonist, never interacts with once on screen, but are still important to the plot of the game. There's a lot of very powerful events that happen off-screen. The player does not interact with the events at all, but they still shape the plot. Edgar, are you still upset that my phone rang like half an hour ago? Homeboy, you got to get over it. You got to move on with your life. So, 12 also completely rebuilt the battle system. The battle system is totally different now. The best way I can describe it in a short sentence is to say that it's an MMO battle system without the MMO. Let me find a new Esper for Celeste here. You got quick. Oh, Ultima. There you go. Your characters will auto-attack. Or they'll auto-do anything. You can kind of program your characters using gambits to tell them what to do. The actual battles are then pre-programmed. If you move close enough to monsters, who are now just on the map, you don't have a separate battle screen, or just inhabiting the game world now, your characters will automatically look at their gambit and say, okay, what am I programmed to do in this case? And then they'll do it. So that leads to another criticism of the game that I don't feel is fair, which is, oh, the game just plays itself. The game doesn't play itself. I would love to see somebody sit down with Final Fantasy XII and have it, quote-unquote, play itself. You need to spend a lot of time developing your characters and programming their gambits so they act in a way that is beneficial to you. And each new map, each new boss fight is going to require different gambits. Step 1 is you go in with Libra, you find out what kind of monsters are here, you find out what they're weak to. You find out if they have weaknesses that can be exploited, you find out if they have spells or status effects they're going to put on your party. That gives you enough information to program your gambits for the area. And then it's just satisfying sitting back and watching your characters do what you told them to do. Like, let's imagine Final Fantasy VI had this system. How many times in this video when I've been on the Veldt have I just input an attack command? I have to do it manually every time. There's no auto-battle command, nothing like that. In Final Fantasy XII, I'd say, okay, Gao, your gambit is Rage Stray Cat. Okay, Terra, your gambit is Attack. Realm, your gambit is Attack. Celeste, your gambit is... I think it's just called Attack, right? It's not X-Fight, yeah, it's just Attack. All I have to do is put the controller down and walk around the Veldt and watch them do their thing. In a more complicated situation, if I want enemies to be put to sleep or be confused or whatever, I can program that in as well. Also, because battles are not compartmentalized. That's a hard word to say. Edgar, you couldn't say that word either. Don't look at me like that. He's never spoken a single syllable, let alone 5 in a row. Because the battles are... You don't go to another screen to fight. All the battles are on your map. Now buffs become a very useful part of the system. Like, yeah, my characters have a lot of buffs right now. Everybody's got Protect and Shell and Haste and Regen, but those aren't spells. Those are relics I found to give them. In Final Fantasy XII, it's worthwhile casting Protect and Shell and Haste and so on, because that spell it'll last for a long time. It wears off eventually, but you'll be able to fight 5 or 6 encounters in that period. In this game, if I could go into my menu and cast Protect outside of battle and have it persist through 5 random encounters, that would be the most important spell in the game. As it happens, I don't think I've cast Protect once in this entire game. And the only time I've used Shell is in a particular boss fights where I knew I would need it, and then I used an Esper that can cast it on everybody at once. In Final Fantasy XII, you can make those strategic decisions on a macro level and have them filter down and apply to all of the random encounters that you have to fight. So there's just a lot to like about the game. However, it has... And I didn't recognize this as a flaw until I played the remake, but it has a license board. And the license board is kind of like the Sphere Grid, except it's not quite as linear. Instead of individual nodes connected by linear paths, the license board is set up like a checkerboard. And everybody starts out at a different place on the license grid, but it's the same license grid for every character. And whenever you unlock a license, half of the grid unlocks new spells and abilities, the other half of the grid unlocks new equipment. And every time you obtain a license, you get this really satisfying sound effect, you get this little animation. Who learned Holy? My boy Gao learned Holy. Could you... Ooh, yeah, those would be good for you. Take those. I know we've got Rages that can do all that, but Gao's another character who, because he's kind of magic-focused, giving him a lot of spells is... It's a good way to live your life. So yeah, you unlock something on the license grid, you unlock the checkerboard, whatever's on the checker that you took, but then it unlocks the 4 adjacent ones. And in doing so, you kind of carve a path around the license board, taking the licenses that you want. And so we have the same problem we have in Final Fantasy V. We have decision paralysis. You have the... If you're going to gravitate towards the most efficient manner, you're going to set up your characters in a way where everybody knows everything, and you don't actually have to explore the game systems. So they made a remake of Final Fantasy XII. They actually did 2 remakes, and they're both distinct games. The first is the International Zodiac Job System, IZJS, which never came out in North America. I think it came out in Europe. And then they released a version just recently here called the Zodiac Age, which is essentially IZJS with some differences. So what IZJS does is it goes all the way back to Final Fantasy I. You have to pick a job for each character. There are 12 jobs in the game. Each job has its own license board. You cannot change jobs. That's how far back they reached into Final Fantasy history to build their new system with. You cannot change jobs. So for example, if I made my main character, Vaughn, an archer, he's an archer for the whole game. He can equip bows, he has a small set of archer abilities, that's it. And you do that for each of your 6 characters in turn. Here's why this is a great thing. Then the Zodiac Age builds on that, and at a certain point in the game, you can pick a second job for each character. Not a sub-job. Not like Final Fantasy V, where, oh, my archer can now, I can give him like 1 white magic spell. No, I can make my archer into an archer/white mage with the full benefits of both and access to all of the licenses of both. And why it's a good thing is the same reason the Fiesta is good for Final Fantasy V. When you have those restrictions, Realm knows Flare now. When you have those restrictions, it really forces you to learn. Go ahead and get holy. It really forces you to learn all of the different weapon types. What are the difference between a sword, a great sword, a katana, a knife, and a ninja sword? Those are all distinct weapon types in Final Fantasy XII that all do different things and work in different ways. And you really have to learn the ins and the outs of those because now your character is locked into one. And one problem I fixed immediately in Final Fantasy XII, you have 6 people in your party, but only 3 in the active party, and there's really no reason to level up all 6. All you really need to do is just teach 3 characters everything, and just have them do everything, and then you don't need backup characters at all, really. But in Final Fantasy XII, no party of 3 can do everything, because a party of 3 is by necessity limited by the jobs you've chosen for them. So the way I played is I used all 12 of the jobs on the board. I gave each of my characters 2 of them, so I have access to all of the licenses in the game. And so I have to mix and match characters a lot. I really have to learn how do all the different weapon types work. Is there value to these magics and techniques that I didn't use on previous playthroughs? And what I've discovered is a much deeper and much more interesting game because of those restrictions. So essentially what the Zodiac Age has done is taken the Final Fantasy V 4-job Fiesta rules, codified them on a programming level. I do think it's a mistake that it doesn't have the original license board in the game for players who missed it the first time around. I do think there's still value in having that option. I think what should have done is after you complete the game the first time, unlock that as like a New Game Plus feature. Final Fantasy X, the HD release of that, lets you pick which of the 2 sphere grids you want to have. Whether you want to have the original sphere grid or you want to have the slightly more open international sphere grid, which by the way does
doesn't fix any of the problems in the game.
But Final Fantasy XII, if you put a gun to my head and told me I had to pick a favorite Final Fantasy game and then stick with it forever, and I was never allowed to change my mind, I would probably go with 12. It's an exceptional game across the board, and the Zodiac Age is even better. But a lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people complained about it. Oh, it plays itself. You don't get to make decisions during battle. Like, oh, it's, where's all my anime tropes? The plot's too hard to follow. I don't have all the characters I'm used to. So they went, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take all your complaints about Final Fantasy XII, flip them over, and apply them all to a new game, and it's called Final Fantasy XIII. And of course, everybody hated it, and everybody complained about it. So people don't know what they want. World keeps spinning. Final Fantasy XIII, I really like it. I enjoyed it a lot. It's a much more replayable game than 12. It's a lot easier to pick up and play. I think it's not as deep of a game. It's a very shallow game, in fact. In fact, I would say it's as shallow as like Final Fantasy IV and IX in terms of decisions you make to build your characters and decisions you make inside of combat. So you still have a macro level combat system. Most of your party is uncontrollable. And they each have, I think there's 6 jobs over the game, but they're not the standard Final Fantasy jobs. They invented new jobs for the game that are more like party roles. Like Commando is your party leader, Ravager is your main damage dealer, you've got Medic, which is your main healer, and so on and so forth. So you have a page on your menu where you kind of program your party at like a high level. You don't go down to the nitty-gritty like 12 where you're picking individual circumstances for individual attacks. Instead, what you're doing is say, okay, I'm going to switch to this paradigm. This paradigm tells my entire party what roles to be. And then they go into those roles, and each role has an AI script associated with it that will pick abilities automatically based off of Libra information. And what I mean by that is you saw me use the Libra spell in this game to scan enemies with weaknesses. Libra is not a spell in Final Fantasy XIII. It's kind of a game system. You can use Libra to learn about monsters, and then all the information you learn about the monster goes into a bestiary. And every time your character goes to choose an action based on their role, they look at that Libra information. A Ravager goes, oh, this monster's weak to fire, I'm going to hit it with fire spells. That's kind of how Final Fantasy XIII works. But you have to work for that Libra information. Either by trial and error, like, oh, I'm going to cast fire on this monster and see if it's weak to it. If it is, that Libra information gets added to my database and I can automatically use it later. Or you can use a Libra ability that automatically adds all of a monster's stats into that database. You have a little more control over your party leader. In Final Fantasy XIII, you can enter individual commands if you want. I think the major thing I would change about 13's battle system is I would let you change party leader in the middle of the battle. 13 doesn't allow you to do that. I hope at one point the game gets a remake that does. I think that would make the game a lot stronger. It does help, though, that the game's main character is kind of the best all-arounder. The main character is Lightning, and I love Lightning. She's one of my favorite Final Fantasy characters. I love her visual design in the first game. She gets a really great spread of abilities in her roles in 13. She can do a little bit of fighting, a little bit of healing, a little bit of everything. So when I played 13, I played through it start to finish twice, and I intend to stream it in the near future. It's possible that by the time this episode of Final Fantasy VI airs, that stream will have already occurred. So please don't watch this video, then run to my Twitch channel and be like, Brickroad, where's the 13 at? You done promised, fool? Because it might already be in the past. Where 13 falls down hard is the story is incomprehensible. And I don't mean it has a bad localization the way that's... well, this guy we can just fight. The way that Final Fantasy VIII does. And I don't mean it's just built on circumstance and whatever, the way Final Fantasy V. I mean the story is actually incomprehensible. Character motivations don't make sense. Villain motivations don't make sense. Your characters will do one thing in one scene, do the opposite thing in the next scene, and there's no explanation for why that occurred. The game has this rich tapestry of lore and mythology surrounding it, which is fun to read on a wiki page, but in the actual game just doesn't matter at all. Like, nothing matters as far as the plot. The writing is okay. The story, the characters rather, I really enjoy. I like the cast of 13 a lot, and the characters' interactions are really nice in a lot of the scenes. They've paid a lot of attention to the character interactions to make sure that each character not only exists in and of themselves, but also exists as a reflection of one of the other characters. You get a little bit of the game with Lightning and Saz. You get a little bit more of the game with Lightning and Hope. You get a little bit of the game with Lightning and Vanille. You get a little bit more of the game with Vanille and Saz. Sometimes these are gameplay sections where you have two characters in your party and you get a lot of banter between the two. Sometimes these are just inside of cutscenes and story sections, but you really get a good sense of not only who each character is, but how each character sees the rest of the group. And I really like that about 13. I just wish they could apply that to a game that has a good story, which 13 doesn't. 13 has a couple of sequels, and the sequels get more unfocused and incomprehensible as you go. Final Fantasy XIII-3 is called Lightning Returns, and in that game, the world is ending in X amount of days, except Lightning is anime Jesus, and she can save the world. She was literally chosen by God to go down and solve everybody's problems, even though everybody is immortal and lives forever. And I'm pretty sure I didn't embellish any of that. I'm pretty sure all of that is is pretty accurate. So one cool thing about 13 is that it's still a pretty modern game. It still looks really pretty by modern standards. You can get it on Steam. I see it goes on sale from time to time. If you like modern JRPGs that have more active battle systems, that have better animations and things, I would recommend 13. I don't think it's a very good emissary of the Final Fantasy series. I don't think it does a very good job of saying, hey, this is what this series is about. But a lot of what this series is about is innovation, trying things and seeing what works in each new installment. And from that standpoint, I think Final Fantasy XIII has a lot to offer. So the big criticism of Final Fantasy XIII, and again, I think this criticism is undeserved, is it's too linear. It's a game of hallways. A lot of the maps in the game, especially for the first 20 hours or so, for the first act of the game, essentially, all you're really doing is walking down a single-file hallway to the end to fight the boss and whatever. And I don't think that criticism is totally fair. It's not that it's untrue. Put your miracle shoes back on, lady. It probably would have been faster just to use an antidote, actually. It's not that it's untrue, it's that criticism is applicable to, I would say, every Final Fantasy game ever made. Every Final Fantasy, even 6. We've been through some cool dungeons in 6. But every dungeon in 6 is pretty linear. There's one or two treasures to find. Sometimes there's a secret area. Sometimes there's a sub-boss. Until you get to the world of Ruin, where the dungeons really kind of open up and breathe a little more. But especially in 7, 8, 9, where every dungeon is just a series of pre-rendered rooms that don't move and can't move. And 10, where every dungeon was, literally a straight line. Sometimes it's not like a rigid line. Sometimes the line loops around itself, but you can look at the mini-maps of 10, just the map screen that you get, and see, oh, it's just a literal line that kind of goes up and does a corkscrew and a curlicue and comes back down. And that's the pedigree that Final Fantasy XIII works with. So it's not that it's untrue, it's that I don't feel it's fair criticism for fans of this series to lob at that one particular game. It's like Physician Heal Thyself. Every game in this series has dungeons like that. If you want really imaginative dungeons, and let's not run the game down, 13 does have some imagination in its dungeons. They're all visually stunning. You get some dungeons, Terra's dead. I do not like it that Terra is dead. Oh, this is going to win the fight though. So Terra's just, this isn't going to count for our shield on cursing. Dang it. Oh, he's still alive. Oh, we're going to get it after all. Beautiful. Let Like in one dungeon, you get to hop in a giant robot and shoot a bunch of guys. In another dungeon, there's these like combat arenas that you jump down into. Then you either have to fight the monsters in the bottom or evade them somehow. Some dungeons you have to open up paths. It's not that they're completely without imagination. It's just that the quality of them does not reach beyond what has come before in like Final Fantasy VI. And when you look at the actual maps of the dungeons, when you get the top-down mini-map of the dungeon, a lot of them just do look like, oh, it's just a line. But that's true in 12, too. When you look at the world maps of 12, there's a lot of lines with connecting areas. But when you're actually down in the dungeon, it feels much more expansive than that. There's a lot more to them than that. So that's not a criticism that I would lob against Final Fantasy XIII. It's not that it's not true, it's that it's not complete. I feel that it's very disingenuous. Oh, this drives me up the wall. When somebody whose favorite Final Fantasy game is 10, they love 10, but hate 13, because 13 is too linear. Final Fantasy X doesn't let you go back to old areas after you leave them, until the very end of the game. Final Fantasy X, every dungeon is a straight line. Realm learned holy... I think at this point, because we're winding down, we're coming into the last 20 fights or so, I think Realm's got pretty much... Oh no, she doesn't have Flood. Yeah, we'll give her Flood, why not? Yeah, well, it looks like we're just going to have enough room to get all the girls, all the spells we want, plus get Gao several spells that he might want. You know what, I'm just going to destroy these guys with magic, because I know they're going to use Invisible on themselves. You don't have Holy yet, and I think they... Quake will hurt us. Banish won't hit them. Oh, you know what? You can attack them. Even if they're invisible, you can attack them. You can use Ultima. Wahaha. So Final Fantasy XIII is the best in the 13 series. They did 13, they did 13-2, and they did Lightning Returns. They were originally launched 13 as it's going to be a trilogy. There's going to be 3 games called Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIII Versus, and Final Fantasy XIII Agito. And eventually, Final Fantasy XIII did get 3 games, but they weren't Versus and Agito. Eventually, Final Fantasy XIII Agito came out as Final Fantasy Type 0, which I'm also not talking about on this list. I played it, but I haven't finished it. I don't think it's very good. We'll leave it at that. And Final Fantasy XIII Versus came out as Final Fantasy XV, which is the last game we have to talk about for these last, I don't know, 20 battles or so. It says I've got 229 battles on my counter, but I might have missed a few. I don't know. We'll work on the assumption that I've missed a few, I guess. Final Fantasy XV is still kind of brand new, and if you haven't seen it, I've done a Let's Play on the channel of one part of Final Fantasy XV. That's kind of an isolated part of the game, and it kind of stands on its own. Like, there are individual speedruns out there just for this part of the game. If you haven't watched it and you don't mind the spoilers, I think it's one of my favorite Let's Plays in recent years. But Final Fantasy XV really impressed me. I was sure I was going to enjoy it, because it's a Final Fantasy game, and it's very rare that I don't enjoy a Final Fantasy. It's very rare that I don't like a Final Fantasy title. So I was sure that I was going to enjoy it, but the degree to which I ended up enjoying Final Fantasy XV really took me by surprise. So they say that Final Fantasy XV is the first time Final Fantasy has been open world. That's actually not true. Final Fantasy XII was open world by any reasonable definition of the phrase open worlds. But Final Fantasy XII came out during a time where there wasn't this like open world renaissance, where it wasn't like the basic form of video games. So Final Fantasy XII didn't get the props it deserved on that front. Final Fantasy XV got them instead. We'll let that slide, because they're both good games. The other thing that really surprised me about 15 that I really liked was the story is very basic. There's a lot of mythology, there's a lot of lore to the setting of 15 that can get kind of as deep as you want it to, however much you want to learn. But the actual story, the actual sequence of events is very simple, really. What are you still missing? I think you done have everything. Go ahead and Hastka and Sloga. Why not? We're kind of going down to the dregs of our Esper list. There is one really useful spell. It's just on an Esper that we haven't gotten yet. and we're not going to be able to get until after all this Veldt grinding is behind us. And I don't want to ruin the plot of 15, so I'll just give like a basic outline. In the world of Final Fantasy 15, it's a contemporary world. Like, it could be kind of any part of the rural American West, basically, is what I think they were aiming at. Which itself is kind of a cool setting for a fantasy game with swords and sorcery and things. Instead of going into the future like 7 and 8 does, instead of going full sci-fi, they just brought it up to like the 1950s. Is kind of the aesthetic they were going for. But in this world, royal blood has power. And not a small power. It has all the power. Like, all the magic in the world stems from the one royal bloodline of Lucis. Your party members, to put this in perspective, you play as Prince Noctis. And you have 3 party members with you for the whole game. Oh, this guy again. And your party members can use magic that you have given them to use, but only because you've given it to them. Like, that is a distinction that does not go unnoticed. It's not like in this game where, oh, I've equipped Ifrit for a little while, so now I can cast fire and I'll be able to cast fire forever. If Gladio wants to cast fire in Final Fantasy XV, he does so because Noctis gives him the ability to do so. I think Edgar's making noises because this recording session has gone on so long now that we're to the point my wife's going to be coming home from work. I kind of slept in later today than I expected. That's okay. That's okay. We'll if it happens, we'll just jump cut again. Won't worry about it. But Noctis is only the prince. He's not the king. He doesn't get to have the giant, world-spanning, super powerful abilities until he becomes the king. So the story of Final Fantasy XV is about Noctis going out into the world and becoming worthy of his crown. That's a pretty cool story, and the way it's presented in the game is very deftly handled. I really, really enjoy it a lot. We're pretty much always going to get the cleave on that guy because he's got so many hit points. Terra's going to hit him several times. Maybe Edgar's just... Oh, now he's barking. Now we're having problems. And so that's why Breath of Fire 3 is my favorite game in that series. And then Breath of Fire 4 came out, and it does a lot of things very different. Wait, no, I wasn't talking Breath of Fire. Well, hold on a second. What was I? Okay, Noctis, yes. Okay, so the story is about Noctis coming into his crown. Is he worthy of wearing the crown? That's a question that gets asked over the course of the game. A lot of characters doubt him. But then circumstances happen to where he's forced into the situation. He doesn't have time to finish growing up. Something happens in the game, and he's now kind of detached from his support network that he grew up with in his childhood of nobility and privilege. He no longer has access to any of that. And there's more to the story, like events happen. But what I really like is how the game explores Noctis coming into those powers. He has to prove that he's worthy of wielding them. His blood gives him the ability to do things. Oh, the shield's done. Oh, okay. I was ahead of myself by quite a bit. So now we have the Paladin shield. And let's just look at the stats on this bad boy. Yeah, so absorbs most elements, negates all of the rest. Everybody can use it, and teaches Ultima at ×1. Hoorah! Look at that evasion, that magic evasion. Best shield in the game by far. So I guess we're just going to leave it at that. I like Final Fantasy XV. It's a good game. Prince Noctis is awesome. Thanks guys for watching, if you watched to the end of this incredibly long video. If not, I mean, I'm not talking to you anyway. I guess I'll see you at the beginning of the next video, but you're already there watching the next video, so that's it.
Shoutouts to Treble for sponsoring this video, and to everybody who helps make my channel possible by supporting me on Patreon.